The following is a special presentation of NBC 41.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. NBC 41 takes us on a journey into our past, and we call it Kansas City Crossroads. It's a collection of stories about people, places, and events woven through time. Crossroads has captured the story of a Rock Island Railroad agent who rescues passengers from a snowbound train on its way to Union Station during the blizzard of 1957. We revisit the days when streetcars careened through the city. We talk with milkmen who delivered milk for the country club dairy. We learn the history of Kansas City barbecue from some of the legends, and many more. So sit back and enjoy some of our favorite stories about this place we call home.
Woven through time, a tapestry of stories defines who we are and gives us a sense of place. From NBC 41, this is Kansas City Crossroads.
Years ago, before the skyscrapers and suburbs, industries and interstates, Kansas City nearly became extinct, a fossil of a once fledgling town on the banks of the Moody Missouri River. Pulled apart by the Civil War, in 1865, Kansas City was left gutted and spiritless. Kansas City had become, as one historian put it, little more than a crossroads town.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Join us now as we follow the trail of an Irish immigrant whose energy and optimism brought Kansas City back from the brink of extinction.
After the war, Kansas City was dazed and desperately short on capital. Approaching railroads promised financial salvation. Kansas City needed a northern connector badly, but so did the nearby military post of Leavenworth. Kansas City was on a downhill track. Without a connector railroad, it would all but die. One man in Kansas City refused to give up, an Irishman from Galway by the name of Charles Esmond Kearney.
It became a real race with the leading citizens of Leavenworth to acquire a railroad. My great-grandfather begged and borrowed $60,000 in private pledges. Just as Leavenworth was about to make a deal with the Hannibal St. Joseph Railroad, he convinced Kansas City into issuing $180,000 in bonds. He raced to Chicago and sold enough bonds so that they could start laying tracks down in Kansas City. He then joined other Kansas Citians in Washington, where they convinced Congress at the very last minute to allocate funds for the building of the very first bridge over the Missouri River at Kansas City.
Building that bridge over the wild and wandering Missouri River turned out to be the biggest challenge in Kansas City's quest for survival. Currents wiped out pilings and washed away timbers. It took 2.5 years to complete the 1,300-yard-long span. Charles Kearney and William Gillis drove the ceremonial last stake on July 3, 1869.
My great-uncle, Frank Warnell, was 14 years old when they dedicated the bridge. He and hundreds of other boys sat up on the bluff as they watched the great engine cross the bridge for the very first time. Everyone was there. There were Indians, farmers, 7 governors, ladies under parasols. It was the greatest day in the history of Kansas City.
Indeed, completion of the Hannibal Bridge was the defining moment in Kansas City's early history. The population grew, new businesses sprouted up. Kansas City's reputation as the nation's crossroads was ensured. Kearney's legacy has carried tens of thousands of passengers and 1 million tons of freight into Kansas City over the years.
Charles Kearney died exactly 100 years ago, but to this day, Kansas City owes a debt of gratitude to the Irishman from Galway who never gave up. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Your attention, please. Rock Island, train number 4, the Golden State Limited from Tucson and Los Angeles, now arriving, track number 19.
For 15 years, Joe Walley's voice bounced from wall to wall here in these grand corridors at Kansas City's Union Station. He was one of Rock Island Railroad's finest. Proud of what he did, proud of his railroad. He'd do anything to make sure his passengers got to where they were going, and on time. But on March 24th, 1957, that simply was not meant to be. Joe Wally was about to cross paths with one of the biggest blizzards in Kansas history.
The alarm came about 10 o'clock at night. Train number 4 is gone, lost, nowhere in sight, no way to find it.
Rock Island's Golden State Limited is on its way to Kansas City. It's been battling a fierce late-season snowstorm all night. Around midnight, it loses.
It turned out that the caked ice under the train braked the train to a halt.
The Golden State and its passengers are stranded near Meade, Kansas. It's cold, dark, and snowdrifts begin to cover the train. Meanwhile, back at Union Station, Joe Wally has no way of knowing where his luxury passenger train is. On board the Golden State, a long, cold night passes into another long, cold day. Passengers grow ill from the lack of fresh air and toxic carbon monoxide in the trapped cars. The rear brakeman knew he had to find help.
The rear brakeman walked back in the blizzard to a pole that had a telephone on it and phone, and if it wasn't for the brakeman, we would never have known.
Joe Wally could now form a rescue plan.
So we assembled a 12-car train and moved it out to get as close as we could.
At this point, passengers have been stranded for the better part of 2 days. Joe Wally and his crew literally push their way through tons of snow to reach the Golden State Limited. After 12 hours, they make it.
When we reached the train, there were no people. The people had been taken to the high school.
So Joe Wally, armed with a warm train and hot food, heads for the school to address his passengers.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for this mishap. However, if you're ready to leave, assemble at the door and we'll go right to the train. Well, that's exactly what they did.
The blizzard of '57 was recorded as the worst Midwest blizzard of the 20th century. The storm buried the plains under 14 inches of heavy, wet snow, with drifts as high as 30 feet.
Joe Wally delivered the passengers of the Golden State Limited to their destinations with restored confidence in the Rock Island Railroad, and a few stories to tell their grandchildren about their adventure on the Kansas plains. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherka. For as long as we've had curiosity, we've wondered about the hundreds of different species of birds flying over our heads. In the 1800s, however, our healthy curiosity was not at all healthy for birds. We studied them by shooting them. But on Christmas Day, 1900, Frank Chapman took the study of birds to a crossroads. On that day, he organized 27 of his friends in 25 locations, and instead of shooting birds, they counted birds. It was the first of what was to become a tradition in North America, as well as Central and South America. Hello, I'm Bill Callaherka for Kansas City Crossroads, and today we're going on a bird count.
At Squaw Creek National Wildlife Refuge, north of Kansas City, Mark Robbins and Brian Barber, along with 45,000 people in more than 1,700 locations, are continuing an almost 100-year-old tradition, the Christmas bird count. They're venturing into the woods, swamps, and marshes on a quest for birds.
Oh, there they are. They're coming down now. They're right on the horizon.
Mark has been part of this event since he was 13 years old, when he first counted birds at Squaw Creek. Since then, he's become quite an expert on his feathered friends.
Another bald eagle. Sitting in a tree, a nice adult.
Now a curator and author on the subject of birds, he has an eagle eye for identifying what he sees through his powerful binoculars.
And what's distinctive about that's that huge white rump, and it's got long, narrow wings and a long, narrow tail. So that's called the northern harrier.
It's a balmy 60-degree day, a rare treat for veterans of Christmas bird counts in Missouri.
Look at this. Wow. Oh, there's probably 1,000 blackbirds right there. Golly, that's spectacular.
If you look, the birds will dance for you. If you listen, they will call to you. Because Mark's been doing this for more than 30 years, he's particularly good at looking and listening. Other than the thrill of discovery and a near-perfect day with nature, the Christmas bird count serves an important purpose. Birds give us valuable information about our own well-being. What happens to birds may soon happen to us. If a species disappears from an area, it signals something is awry with their habitat. Counts like these helped save the bald eagle from extinction.
Hey, here comes an eagle. It's going to fly right over us.
And today at Squaw Creek, the eagle soars with more than 65 other species of birds identified on this Christmas count.
This is so beautiful. God, fantastic. This is the way they end a count.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. In 1876, the Santa Fe rail line was carrying civilization to the Wild West. But what met passengers along the way was anything but civilized. Undesirable accommodations, even less than appetizing food.
A man by the name of Fred Harvey set out to change that. He believed passengers seeking adventure in the untamed West still deserved a well-prepared meal, served in civilized surroundings. And so, Fred Harvey tamed the Wild West with a fork, knife, and spoon, and an army of women he called Harvey Girls. Fred Harvey's ad was simple but effective. Young women left the familiar comforts of home to become Harvey Girls, farmers' daughters trying to help support their families, others looking for the excitement of travel or the freedom that an independent job offered. Being a Harvey Girl opened up opportunities that young women at the time had never even dreamed of.
You know, they said that some people looked down on waitresses in those days, but not the Harvey Girls. They had to have good morals and good reputation. Everything had to be done just right. Of course, some didn't pass the test, so they were let go.
Through the years, books and movies did much to romanticize the life of a Harvey Girl, but the reality was quite different.
Going home and soaking my feet is what I remember the most, because it was very hard work. It was something I was not wanting to do for a lifetime on concrete floors. That kitchen was huge.
One of the rewards for all those long hours was a pocketful of tips at the end of the day. A dime was the customary tip from servicemen who passed through Union Station on their way to assignments during World War II.
The soldiers were very nice, all of them were very nice, and they would kid with us, but you could tell they were very nervous because there was wartime, you know. They always left 10 cents for a tip. But see, we was only getting 42 cents an hour. 42 cents, and our tips were tremendous.
Quarter tips were available in the Westport Room, a favorite spot for travelers and Kansas Citians who had a little more time for a leisurely meal.
It was well-presented food, so far different than it was originally along the train lines. In fact, that's why Fred Harvey got this whole idea started, was that along the lines the food was so bad that he said, he was a freight agent, and he said, well, if the food is that bad, surely I can do better than that. And that's how he got started with them.
The Fred Harvey Company grew to more than 100 restaurants and lodges throughout the country, leaving a legacy not only on the restaurant industry, but in the hearts of nearly 100,000 Harvey Girls who donned those crisp white aprons.
The doors closed on this Union Station location in 1968, retiring the Harvey Girls, whose stories are part of our scrapbook of memories of this grand old place. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Most historians agree Jesse James was a murderer and a thief who died before his 35th birthday. During the course of 16 years, the James gang robbed banks and trains and stagecoaches, and dozens of innocent people died. If it hadn't been for the Civil War, some speculate Jesse probably would have been a Baptist minister, like his father, and Frank would have been a school teacher. History, however, records a different account. Many stories surround the legend of Jesse James, some true, some not. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, through the storytelling of Sanford Lee, we're taking you back 150 years to a tale about one of the most notorious criminals in our country's history.
This is the home where Frank and Jesse James were raised, and if these walls could talk, they would tell some incredible stories. My grandmother used to tell me a story about an old lady who lived in a small farm in rural Missouri. It was about 1870. One morning, two mysterious strangers came to her door. They asked her if she'd fix them a meal. They'd been on the road for several days and hadn't eaten, and they were willing to pay for it. Well, they seemed nice, polite young men, so she invited them in. As she fixed their meal of beans and rice and biscuits, she told them of her woes, her troubles. Her husband had died just 2 years before. Nobody was working her farm. She had no income. And that very day, a fellow from the bank was going to come and repossess her home because she owed the bank $800. Well, the gentleman ate quietly, and when they finished, one stood up, reached in his pocket, took out a roll of bills, and counted out $800 and handed it to her, said, "You take this, ma'am. You remind me of my mother. Besides, I told you we'd pay you for our meal." She said, "But it was just beans and rice and biscuits." He said, "Yes, ma'am, but those are the finest biscuits I've ever had." They left her peacefully and went on their way. Later that afternoon, the fellow from the bank came with the foreclosure papers. She handed them back to him, along with the $800 in cash she'd been given, and she said, "Now I want a receipt, paid in full." When he went back to town, he was stopped in the road by two mysterious strangers who relieved him of his $800, his gold watch, and his horse. When he walked back into town, he reported the incident to the sheriff. And on the wall, he saw two wanted posters for the very men who had robbed him that day. It was Frank and Jesse James.
According to most accounts, Jesse died April 3rd, 1882, and was buried here in Kearney, Missouri. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Nowadays, we can order a fancy dinner by fax or contact the babysitter by email. But at 5:45, when the car phone rings, often it's the age-old question, can you pick up some milk on the way home? Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Many of us in Kansas City remember a more convenient time when the milk came to us. Yes, long before convenience stores and drive-through windows, a fleet of milk trucks and a small army of milkmen brought fresh milk right to our door.
Generations of Kansas Citians lick their lips when they hear the words Country Club Dairy. It was here at 56th and Troost that a squadron of delivery trucks loaded up every morning with what many believe were the best-tasting dairy products in town. In 1927, J.V. and C.B. Quigley formed a partnership with the most progressive dairymen in the area and founded the Country Club Dairy, selling and delivering only properly pasteurized whitelist milk.
J.V. went to see the doctors and called on different doctors and told them what his product was, what the product was at the dairy. The doctors liked it. The doctors were glad to have a dairy where they knew the milk was pasteurized and safer for a child.
By the 1950s, the Country Club Dairy employed 400 people. At the height of the post-war baby boom, the Quigleys and their partners sold almost 1 million pounds of milk a day. Men like Clarence Gregory and Bill Johns were a welcome sight in Kansas City's neighborhoods.
Those days, early in the late 40s, early 50s, most of the ladies were home, so it was no problem to get in the house. However, if they weren't home, I carried about 90% of the keys to the route. If I didn't have the key, it was under the mat, on the lamp, or behind the mailbox. If I didn't have the key or access to the house, the door was left open, and we went in, took care of the milk business, turned off the stoves, put the cat out, mailed the letters, and that was about the history of the dairy industry.
Kids in the neighborhood in the summertime, they pile in the truck to get the loose ice and eat it. And we'd come out, we'd have to run them out. We'd get down to the next stop, get out, and the kids were back in the truck again. And that happened lots of times in different neighborhoods.
Home deliveries were handy, but it was the Country Club Dairy's enormous soda fountain, the thick chocolate shakes, the nickel ice cream cones, and the scrumptious flying saucer sundaes that sparks the fondest memories. The Quigley brothers' plan to make and sell safe milk products was so successful the Country Club Dairy was ultimately acquired by a national operator. Families got smaller and the deliveries ceased. In 1976, most of the old dairy was torn down, leaving only the taste of nostalgia for generations of Kansas Cityans.
The Country Club Dairy makes you hungry for the old times, doesn't it? For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
In 1898, dies were cast in the small Missouri town of Nevada that would give Kansas Cityans and people all over the country something to look up to.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Today we look up to William Franklin Norman and how he and a handful of others took the ceiling over our heads to a crossroads.
At the turn of the century, a stroll by the W.F. Norman Company would be quite jarring. A constant crashing noise, the earth literally shook. It was Mr. Norman pounding a good business out of tin. Mr. Norman was affording the average person a chance to have what looked like a very expensive, hand-carved plaster ceiling.
When my grandfather made a deal with a local tinner, John Berghauser, they started the business in 1898. This is the 100th anniversary of the company. So they made quite a success of it.
For the next 3 decades, W.F. Norman put his stamp on the architecture of the country. His tin ceilings were hanging in churches, banks, shops, and homes in Kansas City and across the land. But the Great Depression brought new construction to a halt, and in order to keep his drop hammer presses from doing the same, W.F. Norman reshaped his tin company, making metal shower enclosures, caskets, and temporary grave markers. The tin ceiling business appeared to be dead and buried.
But 1930 was the time when architectural designs were changing and people just simply didn't want it.
Then in 1978, modern-day tin man Bob Quitno and his family bought the W.F. Norman Company and discovered a national treasure. The old dies were still there, stacked to the ceiling.
We had to learn how to make the ceilings again. We had to figure out how the stamping process worked. We had to get some literature. We copied a 1909 catalog that we still send out. We had to figure out the kind of metal to be used. There was a lot of trial and error in determining how to make them, and quite a few months figuring out how we could make the ceilings again. Nobody around here still remembered how to make them.
Today, the Quitno family carries on the legacy of W.F. Norman. As one of only 2 such manufacturers in the country, the W.F. Norman Company pounds out tin ceilings the same way the company did in 1898.
We don't know of any modern equipment that can make it better. Those drop hammers can be dropped from varying heights. They're easy to repair. We've seen some ceilings made with more modern equipment that don't seem to have the detail ours do, and we think it's the best equipment we know of to make the ceilings.
I didn't think it would ever come back, but it's made a marvelous renaissance.
With W.F. Norman ceilings installed in impressive new structures like this, the future of the tin business is looking up. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
What made the men of old Kansas City so stout-hearted and healthy, so vigorous and full of good cheer? Why, beer, of course. Good old-fashioned ales and lagers brewed right here in Kansas City. Thousands of barrels of locally made elixir were served up fresh and hearty to cattle drovers, streetcar conductors, and directors of banks.
I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Before Prohibition, brewing beer was a big business in town. Kansas City was never a match for St. Louis, but there was a time when it aimed to be.
With their duffel bags and steamer trunks, Kansas City's early arrivals brought with them a taste for beer. By 1858, a handful of immigrants had begun lovingly brewing their famous liquid bread.
My family's history in the beer business in Kansas City had kind of an unusual beginning. My great-grandfather, James Flanagan, settled in Kansas City in 1881. He was an Irish immigrant, and he started out as a saloon keeper. He owned a tavern in the West Bottoms on about 1700 West 9th Street, known as James Flanagan's Place. It supposedly had the longest bar in the world and was located on what was known as the wettest block in the world, where 23 out of the 24 buildings in the vicinity were saloons.
One of Kansas City's best-known brewers was the Heim family. In 1887, they established a massive brewery complex in the East Bottoms that brewed up hundreds of thousands of barrels of Charnagle Select and Barish. The Heims even built an amusement park and beer garden on site, with a direct pipeline to the brewery, and had their own streetcar line.
Michael Heim, one of the three and the youngest of the Heim brothers, started Electric Park. Electric Park was one of the most fantastic amusement parks in the country at its time. If you look from a historical perspective, the breweries that were open in pre-Prohibition Kansas City, the owners of those plants were very, very wealthy families. The wealth that they managed to gain from the sales of their beer in this town all went back to community and civic-minded things. The park and recreation systems, the boulevards, buildings, obviously the Muehleback Hotel, the electric park, the whole idea of the amusement industry, the entertainment industry in this city, all those things were helped develop in the early stages of the city's development by the owners of the breweries.
With repeal and the welcome respite from bathtub gin, beer making returned to Kansas City. One of the only survivors was Muehleback's smooth-foamed Pilsner. The Muehleback family and its popular beer tapped the loyalty of a generation of sports fans. But by 1956, it had spread itself too thin, and the last local beer was swallowed by a bigger brewer from Milwaukee.
The next 33 years, Kansas City did without a brew of its own. But alas, tastes are changing. Beer with personality and a local flavor is in style again. Witness the success of Boulevard Brewery, started in 1989 with the help of an old brewmaster from Muehleback. We may never rival St. Louis, but when it comes to local connoisseurs, there's nothing like the taste of a hometown beer. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherka.
When my mother started us to Sunday school, she gave us a chance to meet the other children in Independence. I met a very beautiful little lady with lovely blue eyes and the prettiest golden curls I've ever seen. We went through Sunday school, grade school, high school, and we're still going along hand in hand. She was my sweetheart and ideal when I was a little boy, and she still is.
In 1890, a young man from Independence fell in love. What transpired over the next 7 decades may be one of the sweetest love stories ever.
June 22nd, 1911. Dear Bessie, speaking of diamonds, would you wear a solitaire on your left hand should I get it? I've always had a sneaking notion that someday maybe I'd amount to something. You may not have guessed it, but I've been crazy about you ever since we went to Sunday school together. But I never had the nerve to think you'd even look at me. I don't think so now, but I can't keep from telling you what I think of you. More than sincerely, Harry. July 12, 1911. Dear Bessie, you know that you turn me down so easy that I'm almost happy anyway. Very sincerely, Harry.
By 1913, Bess decided she had fallen in love with the persistent farmer who continued courting his sweetheart with a shower of letters. As Harry left for duties during World War I, Bess sent her picture along with a note.
Dear Harry, you didn't expect me in Fort Sill so soon, did you? I'm depending on this to take you to France and back, all safe and sound. Bess.
November 24th, 1917. Dear Bess, I got your picture last night, and I've had such a wide smile ever since that everyone has remarked about it. It is sure a speaking likeness, and I really can't tell you how glad I am to have it. Unless you come yourself, you could have sent me nothing that I'd like better. Yours, Harry. November 11th, 1918. You evidently did some very excellent work as a Liberty Bond saleswoman, because I saw in the Stars and Stripes where some 22 million people bought them and that they were oversubscribed by $1 billion, which is some stunt for you to have helped pull off. Here's hoping to see you soon. Yours always, Harry.
March 11th, 1919. Dear Harry, I'll be just about ready alrighty when you come, and then we can settle the last details. May said Mr. Morgan had a job waiting for you, and if you should decide to put in part of your time there, you'll have another home waiting for you in Independence, for nothing would please Mother any better. Loads of love, devotedly, Bess.
On the next Kansas City Crossroads, the Truman love story continues after World War I. I'm Bill Calaherka. Harry Truman was 6 years old when he found his true love in Sunday school. Her name was Bess. From that moment on, he idolized her, and perhaps he expressed that best through the letters he wrote to her.
Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. We pick up the Truman love story at the end of World War I, when Harry came home to Bess. On June 28, 1919, soon after his return from the war, Harry and Bess were married here at the Trinity Episcopal Church in Independence, just a few blocks east of Bess's house. Their daughter Margaret was born in 1924.
As Harry's political career soared, he and Bess once again put pen to paper and added a few more chapters to their love story.
June 28, 1935. Dear Bess, this is the day 16 years ago that I made a plunge and took a chance for which I have been a better man. Kiss Margie. Love to you, Harry. July 28, 1939. Dear Bess, I succeeded in getting a real rail bill agreed to and on the Senate calendar yesterday. It regulates subsidiaries and holding companies of railroads. Kiss Margie. Love to you, Harry. June 6th, 1945. Dear Bess, it won't be long until I can sit back and study the whole picture and tell him what is to be done in each department. When things come to that stage, there'll be no more to this job than there was to running Jackson County, and not any more worry. Lots of love, Harry.
June 28, 1948. Dear Bess, 29 years. It seems like 29 days. Detroit, Port Huron, a farm sale, the Blackstone Hotel, a shirt store, county judge, a defeat, Margie, automobile club membership drive, presiding judge, senator, vice president, now. You still are on the pedestal where I placed you that day in Sunday school, 1890. What an old fool I am. HST.
But Harry Truman was anything but a fool. During the course of their lifelong love affair, Harry wrote Bess more than 1,300 letters, a testimony that love at first sight can last forever. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka.
Built to last, a term thrown around so much today it's lost some of its meaning, or at least maybe some of its longevity. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka. If you believe that few things nowadays are truly built to last, we'd like to show you a genuine exception today on Kansas City Crossroads, at a place where a group of 32 craftsmen and artists intersect with the raw materials of wood and metal. The result is a creation that will literally last for centuries, and a sound that goes on forever.
Since 1919, the people inside this 5-story building in Lawrence have been erecting monuments to sound. Reuter pipe organs fill churches and universities all over the country with a joyful noise. The men and women who create these towering musical instruments invest thousands of hours in each one, assembling tens of thousands of individual pieces, all working in harmony. These pipe organs aren't built as much as they are born. Listen to its voice and you can't help but be moved. Each instrument is very much a living, breathing thing. Craftsmen like Gilbert Stone are the proud parents. Patient, nurturing, honing their crafts over decades of time. With the exception of an improved technique here and there, the organ makers at Reuter craft their instruments by hand, just as it was done more than 75 years ago. Machines can't replace the human touch, the feel for the sound. Something these pipe organ makers know in their hearts will endure for many generations to come. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. In the old westerns, dusty cowboy hats made movie stars look larger than life. But for a real cowboy, his hat was more than just a prop. It was his key to survival.
I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Regardless of where you found cowboys, on the big screen or on trails to the west, one man is responsible for bringing style and function to what they wore on their heads. His name, John B Stetson.
In the mid-1800s, brave men and women set out for new opportunities in the West, and John B Stetson was one of them.
John B Stetson grew up in a family in Philadelphia that made felt hats for years. He learned the art of felting from his father. Due to health reasons, he had to head west and get to a different climate. And so he settled in this particular St. Joseph, northwest Missouri area.
At a crossroads in his life, he left Missouri and joined the California Gold Rush.
John B Stetson, on his trek west, ran into a cattle baron whom was wearing an old hide for a head covering. He saw the hat made out of felt that John B was wearing, offered to buy it from him. At that point, John B would not sell it, so he made him one. Then he sold it to him, and thus became the sale of the first John B Stetson hat.
It was that $5 gold piece that launched one of the greatest manufacturing companies of the 19th century. And since John B Stetson's gold fever didn't pan out, he set his sights on the hat business.
The Boss of the Plains hat primarily was the first #1 hat in the Western industry. That's the one that John B Stetson created for the cattle barons and the people that were heading west, which at that point in time was anything west of the Missouri. They use these hats not only for self-protection, but sometimes for survival, both for themselves or for catching water, raindrops and so forth, for survival of their animals.
John B Stetson found his gold mine in something much bigger than little yellow nuggets. He went back home to Philadelphia and eventually opened up a factory because the hat orders were pouring in.
Legend has it that the Stetson, as well as just hats in general, became a means of status, and depending on the type of hat that a man wore, in some cases women also, depending on whether they were wealthy, whether they were accepted, whether they were just a down-and-out cowboy and needed something on his head.
Today the Stetson name is back in St. Joseph. The Stetson factory produces over 1,500 hats a day, much the same way the factories produced the hats back in the early days of John B Stetson.
But the hat that was worth a $5 gold piece to the cattlemen on the Western Plains can now run you up to $3,500. The price you pay for over 100 years of nostalgia. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
In the 1850s, the Missouri River wasn't much different than it is today, considered to be too thick to drink and too thin to plow. It was a big, muddy monster that's eating habits included a healthy diet of steamboats. 289 steamboats, in fact, from St. Louis to Pierre, South Dakota. And while almost all of those boats were either destroyed or are still buried at the bottom of the river, one steamboat has floated to the surface of history, thanks to changing currents, a curious farmer, and a determined team of treasure hunters.
I'm Bill Kalahurka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, we find the Steamboat Arabia in many ways exactly the way it was left on September 5th, 1856, when its hull came to a crossroads with a walnut tree snag.
A side-wheeler built in 1853, the Steamboat Arabia measured 171 feet long and 54 feet wide. It was a floating community carrying people and their entire lives down the river. There were even 2 prefabricated homes on board. The 1850s was the golden era of steamboats, and the levee at Kansas City, which was at that time the town of Kansas, was a major destination. But on this autumn evening in 1856, the Steamboat Arabia was on its way to Omaha, Nebraska, with 222 tons of cargo and 130 passengers, mostly women with children traveling to meet their husbands. They had just left the town of Kansas and were near Parkville when it happened.
The boat ran right into a tree, stuck in the mud, below the surface of the water. The pilot didn't see the log. It began to fill with water. The pilot knew he had a problem, so he turned his wheel, headed for shore, but they never arrived. The boat sank some distance from shore. The water went to the upper decks, and the people rushed as high as they could on the boat. Now, they did have a lifeboat there, and a little at a time, the passengers were put aboard this lifeboat and carried to shore into safety. And there they stood on the bank, huddled in these bushes and among the trees, and looking out across the river. They saw the boat sink, and there was nothing they could do to save the cargo, their personal belongings, all that they carried west with them.
The Arabia was gone forever. At least, so they thought. Over the next century, she would be buried deep by mud, silt, and water. But over time, the river changed course, and the Arabia would no longer be at the bottom of the Missouri River, but under a cornfield near Parkville. Treasure hunters tried to dig down to the Steamboat Arabia as early as 1877, but it wasn't until 1988 that a group of men from Independence performed a large-scale excavation. What they found was a time capsule of life in the 1850s.
And it's almost like finding a dinosaur bone, something that has never been seen before. We'd never seen a steamboat in that time period. We'd seen pictures of them.
Crews worked day and night for weeks digging to the Steamboat Arabia. On the next Kansas City Crossroads, the modern-day treasure hunt continues in this Kansas cornfield. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. The 1850s was the golden era of steamboats, but the mighty Missouri was a perilous path to the west. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, the continuing story of the Steamboat Arabia, a ship lost on September 5th, 1856, when a walnut tree snag sunk it in a matter of minutes. We rejoin the adventure of the Steamboat Arabia as the modern-day treasure hunters dig their way through 45 feet of mud to finally reach the cargo, 200 tons of it, under a Kansas cornfield. There it had rested since the Arabia sank with 130 passengers on board. All the passengers reached the shore safely, but the cargo was thought to be lost forever, until the tenacious crew from Independence succeeded where other treasure hunters had failed. The thrill of discovery yielded hundreds of crates and barrels, a time capsule of life on the American frontier.
Uncovering this boat was like going back into time and spending our days uncovering and unloading a steamboat that had once been loaded in St. Louis 132 years earlier, and finding the boxes of the passengers and the supplies that they sent west.
Family and friends worked side by side, washing away more than a century of silt.
We found dishes that were incredibly well preserved, still wrapped in straw, coming from England, from the factories where they were made, and shipped overseas, and arrived in the United States, only to be lost on this boat.
Recovery of the cargo continued for 4 months, with each day like Christmas Day. Treasures included bolts of cloth, tools, clothing, hats and boots, shiny buttons, rustic guns, everything an 1856 family might need for life in the West. But alas, all the whiskey barrels reported to be on board had already washed away.
When the boat sank, it was supposed to have been carrying, among everything else, 400 barrels of the finest Kentucky bourbon that money could buy in those days. They thought it was worth $1 million.
The 200 tons of recovered treasure is the largest collection of pre-Civil War goods.
Of course, we all had our favorite things, but my favorite were the food items. The bottles of blueberries that were still blue, and cherries that were still red. But to find food products that you could still eat before the Civil War was an incredible thing to find.
Originally, the crew had planned to sell all the cargo to help cover the cost of the dig. Instead, they devised a way to share their discovery, and these modern-day treasure hunters became museum curators, learning the time-consuming art of restoration.
To think that there are sunken ships in Missouri and in Kansas, well, there really are. And it's a real thrill to go out and have the opportunity to go back into history and find the records of these ships and these boats that traveled and wonder what the cargo would be. And it may not be gold and emeralds and gold doubloons, but it would be other things.
The Steamboat Arabia, a story about the spirit of adventure, dreams and determination and buried treasure. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherka.
Long before traffic jams on I-35, people hopped on streetcars to get to work, to school, or to the movies. And no one worried about finding a parking place.
Hello, I'm Bill Callaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. Today we'll take a ride down memory lane to a time when Kansas Citians moved down this path and around the city in familiar yellow streetcars, what some people called a bunch of bananas.
Kansas City jumped on the idea of a street rail system clear back in 1869, when the common mode of transportation was a single car pulled by a pair of horses or mules. It went 5 miles an hour and saved travelers a 4-mile walk to Westport. By the turn of the century, cable cars built in England carried thousands of people each day up and down the city's hilly streets. For a 2-cent fare, some Kansas Citians could get quite a thrill on their way to work. The 9th Street incline from Quality Hill to the West Bottoms was steep enough to rival anything in San Francisco. The municipal transportation system grew so rapidly that nearly 2,000 streetcar operators were needed to move all the passengers. Tunnels were added to lessen some of the steepest routes. Lines extended to Independence, Kansas City, Kansas, St. Joe, and later the Plaza and Waldo.
At one time we had 32 streetcar lines here, just up into the late 40s, and about 700 streetcars.
Hundreds of streetcars carried more than 250,000 fares each day.
My favorite line was Swope Park. It'd take about 3 hours to make a trip from one end to the other, and you only had to make 3 trips, then you'd be done. Whereas on Troost or Country Club or some of them lines, you'd have to make 5 or 6 trips downtown. But it was very pleasant to running that Swope Park. You'd get over there and run down Grand Avenue and Main, and the city was bustling then in those days, you know.
Streetcars served virtually every neighborhood in the city during the course of 8 decades, careening back and forth through the lives of generations of Kansas Citians.
Streetcars, of course, ran in the middle of the street. Traffic had to stop when they'd stop. That was a kind of a nuisance for other people. I think that was one of the reasons they took them off.
The streetcar operators switched to the rubber-tired, go-anywhere buses we know today.
After the war, of course, everybody bought cars, and that took a lot of people off the streetcars and buses.
Old 779 braked for the last time at 75th and Warnell on June 23, 1957. The end of our streetcars marked the end of an era when people traveled around the city together, forming a close-knit community. People courted and fell in love on the streetcars and waved at Santa, who spread holiday wishes along the streetcar routes. Listen for that familiar streetcar bell ringing through our memories. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Her name is Connie, and those who know her truly love her. But this isn't an ordinary love story, because Connie isn't an ordinary object of affection. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Connie is a Lockheed Super G Constellation propeller airplane, a very unromantic name for an airplane that an entire generation of Kansas Citians became very romantic about.
Everybody knows what a Connie is. Outside of the girl's name, it's the only airplane ever called a Connie, and it's stuck. That's kind of short for Constellation. It became a short, lovable term that everybody applied to it, and it just stuck.
Connie was born in 1946 to the Trans World Airline fleet. She was the best of the best.
The majority of their fleet at that time was Constellation because that was the biggest, best, fastest airliner in the world at the time.
In the 1940s, aviation history was at a crossroads. Before the Connie, no other airliner had taken commercial passengers across the Atlantic.
856 Constellations were built by Lockheed at Burbank, California. TWA here in Kansas City had 147, which was more than any other airline in the world.
Connie's 10,000 gallons of fuel could keep her in the air for 26 hours, making her a transportation legend, carrying families and businessmen to destinations they would have normally reached by ocean liner.
When the Connie went in service after the war, it pretty much put the ocean liner out of business because it was so much faster and more comfortable, say 12, 14 hours instead of 5 days to cross the ocean.
But history has a way of repeating itself, and Connie found herself at another crossroads when a new plane began to take off.
Then along come Mr. Boeing with his 707, and he put the Connie out of business.
The reason it was overcome was because of progress. The jets were just faster and cheaper to operate.
So in the late 1960s, Connie was banished to a graveyard until pilots, mechanics, and enthusiasts created the Save a Connie group here in Kansas City. And in 1986, Connie found herself back in the hands of those who loved her and wanted to put her back in the air.
It's such a beautiful airplane, and as close as it came to being scrapped, I think it would probably say thank you. And let's go fly again.
Today, the Save a Connie group still pledges their undying devotion to this flying museum here at Kansas City's downtown airport, where it seems Connie will always be courted by the men who love her. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
As you wander about our fair city, listen for the water. Sometimes you'll hear it gently trickling, and sometimes you'll hear it gushing. And sometimes you'll simply see it reflecting back at you.
It's hard to imagine Kansas City without its fountains, but the city came to an economic crossroads as recently as the 1960s, and the fountains were turned off. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Today we trace the beginnings of the fountains to a time before the turn of the century, to thousands of horses and a few concerned ladies of the Humane Society.
The early fountains were mostly utilitarian, and I'm pleased to say that the Humane Society and the women that were in it raised the money for the very first one. It's hard to believe, but in Kansas City at that time, we had 60,000 to 70,000 horses in this town every day. We really needed some place for everybody to get a drink.
Kansas City soon progressed from utilitarian fountains to more ornate ones that soon proved quite difficult to care for.
The one in Electric Park, for example, I think of it, was a fantastic thing. And a lot of people enjoyed it, but it was very cumbersome and large, and it just could not be maintained.
The cost of maintaining the public fountains soon became more than the city could afford, and fountains moved further down the list of priorities, until Ilis Davis was elected mayor.
When Ike Davis was elected mayor, it was after a very turbulent time in our history. There were 4 years, from 59 to 63, when we had nearly a dozen city managers. The city was nearly broke. And the fountains were all turned off, as incredible as that seems now.
During the first year of Mayor Davis's administration, the city passed an earnings tax. When Frank Vadic was hired by the Park Board in 1964, he succeeded in applying some of that earnings tax money to the fountains, and they began to run again.
That buoyed a lot of people's spirits, and by 1974, then the City of Fountains Foundation was born, and we've been doing better ever since. The fountain that's here is a very special fountain because it was done by a renowned sculptor, Tsudakawa, and his opinion of fountains is very direct. He says any fountain that does not have sculpture in it is just some plumber's toy. But I think his free spirit with this sculpture does make it lovely, particularly in this kind of area. Fountains are uplifting, and they are beautiful. People can appreciate them regardless of their background. They don't have to go to school to understand them. They are reassuring, and they give you a certain sense of serenity that's not always found in every place you go. The fountains are important to the city because they give us a signature. St. Louis has an arch. Denver has mountains. San Francisco has the bay, and we have fountains.
In 1867, prosperity began to beat a path to Kansas City 200 yards wide, all the way from Texas on the backs of cattle. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, we retrace the events that branded Kansas City as a cow town and created a stampede of money and prestige for the city.
In 1866, Texas had more cattle than it knew what to do with, in contrast to northern states where the demand for beef was high. A man by the name of Joseph G. McCoy recognized the imbalance of supply and demand and saw Kansas City as the perfect place to level the scales. McCoy thought if Texas cattlemen could get their herds to Wichita along what was then an Indian trail, he could take them the rest of the way, with the help of the railroad, which ran into Kansas City's West Bottoms.
And the reason that this site was selected for the stockyards was that there's water here, and there's well isn't a place that they could park the cattle, and come and corral them.
Over the next few years, McCoy's idea paid off many times over. A livestock exchange building was built in 1871, but was quickly outgrown. Expansions continued until 1911, when a 9-story building was erected, eventually housing a couple of banks, barbershops, and a restaurant. In less than 40 years, Kansas City became the backbone of the Midwestern livestock industry, built with cash and a cattleman's good word.
There never was a piece of paper between the seller and the buyer. You said you would give, and the seller said, I will take. There was an agreement reached, and there never was a piece of paper. That was the end of it. And never was the one that backed out on his deal. Either side. Had he been, he wouldn't be here.
By the 1940s, it's estimated that the livestock industry drove approximately $350 million into the Kansas City economy and employed 25,000 people.
I believe it was 1941 in the fall. We had 64,000 cattle and calves in one day in this market. But we loaded out 1,000 carloads of cattle and calves that night by rail, going to all parts of the United States in one night. That's quite a load of cattle.
But as with any business, Kansas City stockyards had its share of setbacks. In 1951, a devastating flood literally washed away some of the older buildings. In the main exchange building, water reached the second floor.
And that was the biggest mess you ever saw. There's 6 feet of mud in this place, so we had to get it open. Flood happened in July, and I think we opened up in September. And how we did it, I'll never know.
Finally, in 1991, the livestock industry in Kansas City reached its last crossroads. The pens were dismantled and the stockyards closed, leaving only a few scattered livestock traders in a building that was once bursting at the seams.
But Kansas City's agricultural industry will never be forgotten. Today, these metal sculptures stand just a few blocks from the Kansas City stockyards, a reminder of the history of our city and the industry that made it what it is. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Under cloudless skies, the hum of distant combines signals the season for harvest. In the fields near Mayview, Missouri, brothers Robert and Larry Sonker are harvesting corn. They've been farming all their lives. They learned how to make a living from the soil from their father, who learned from his father. But that tradition is about to change. Robert and Larry's sons have chosen other jobs which take them away from the fields plowed by their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. The Sonkers and many farmers like them are at a crossroads. While the pattern of the cornfields will change very little in the years ahead, the nature of who farms these fields will change dramatically. What's happening here in Mayview and in countless communities across the land signals the passing of an era. A time when men and women worked the land each day and passed those traditions along to their children, who passed them along to theirs. You see, the land that provided a living for Robert and Larry also provided a way of life. That way of life included many long days, with every member of the family lending a hand. But all that hard work doesn't mean the rains will come. Hard work doesn't keep the insects away or ensure a good price for the corn. Robert and Larry know that success or failure is not always within their control. When Robert and Larry retire from these fields and their sons move on to greener pastures, the texture of our landscape changes. These rich family farming traditions will follow the path of the mules and plows that once worked these fields. A part of our uniquely American heritage dies. The harvest is about much more than corn. It's about planting the seeds that nourish the human spirit. It's about reaping what we sow. Where do we find those seeds of contentment? Some of us seek it in the accumulation of wealth or power or fame. Robert and Larry have found contentment in these fields, in their connection to the land and to their families. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
You see people going like this, they're selling. You see people going like this, they're buying. In the final analysis, it's just one person trading with another person.
The pit. It's where fortunes are made or lost, all based on the whims of Mother Nature and the economic climate. Trading as we know it today here at the Kansas City Board of Trade began on the banks of the Missouri River, where a group of big-thinking businessmen met more than 140 years ago to plant an economic seed for our city.
The history of the Kansas City Board of Trade is not unlike the history of other exchanges in this country. For instance, the New York Stock Exchange. As you know, the New York Stock Exchange started with a bunch of traders trading underneath a mulberry tree in New York. And a lot of that was similar to what happened here. We started out very much like a chamber of commerce.
The original members of the Board of Trade, called the Commercial Exchange in 1856, focused on new roads, bridges, and railroad connections. If people and prosperity were going to come to Kansas City, they needed a way to get here. Their vision became reality, and shortly after the Civil War in 1869, the population exploded from 3,500 citizens to 85,000 by 1882. 1869 was also the year the Commercial Exchange officially changed its name to the Board of Trade.
We were founded as a place where farmers, elevator operators, flour millers, and bakers could shed themselves of the risk of price volatility. A bunch of people got together and started a marketplace.
Once again, Kansas City found itself at the right place at the right time.
We've been around for 142 years, and early we were a very logical site for a marketplace because of transportation patterns. As I'm sure you know, Kansas City was and is today a major railroad hub. That means that a lot of grain ended up in Kansas City.
And that grain never stopped, thanks to a wheat seed brought over from Russia. Kansas wheat production went from 4.5 million bushels a year in 1873 to 25 million bushels a year in 1880.
The Kansas City Board of Trade has enjoyed, I think, a spectacular but a very measured growth. For the first 130 years of our history, we were primarily a hard red winter wheat futures market.
And thanks to that wheat, Kansas City basks in the glory of being the center of the agriculture futures trading market.
We take great pride in the fact that if you're in Kansas City or you're in Salina, Kansas, or you're in Beijing or you're in Sydney, if you want to know the price of wheat, it's the price that is discovered on our floor.
Today, nearly 50 million bushels of wheat are traded daily here at the Kansas City Exchange. That's quite an increase over the first 1,000 bushels in the olden days. The founders of the Board of Trade left us a legacy of prosperity and positioned Kansas City as the world's breadbasket. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka.
In the small town of Atchison, Kansas in the early 1900s, there lived a little girl full of spunk. Gifted with her imagination and a pure obsession with adventure, she turned her home on the bluffs of Missouri into a playground of imaginary journeys. Eventually, the spirit of this young lady from Atchison would take a very new phenomenon called aviation to one of its first crossroads. And as you're about to find out today on Kansas City Crossroads, it was what Amelia Earhart was born to do.
We'll never forget Amelia and her plane.
From the start, she was adventurous. She slid down streets in Atchison, Kansas, underneath the bellies of horses. When Amelia was a little girl in Atchison, she was always in motion. And in the backyard of her home in Atchison, I'm told that she rigged a sort of a roller coaster toy that could have brought disaster to the neighborhood children, but it was Amelia's idea of fun. Her mother, as we've said, didn't stop her from doing any of these things, even wearing bloomers instead of skirts back in early 1900s. And her father was a very bright, very intelligent man, and he's the one who took her to see her first airplane. And I think between the two of her parents, it wasn't that they didn't say no, it was just that they thought she can do it, and they let her. And when you grow up with people who are fairly confident in you, you develop a confidence in yourself.
That confidence followed Amelia throughout her childhood in Atchison and into her college days at Ogontz, near Philadelphia. Bored and restless, Amelia never finished college. The spark she carried for adventure would not let her rest. So she left school in search of more colorful horizons.
She went to various places and saw airplanes, but actually she really got interested when she went to California and started flying out there. On her 25th birthday, she got her first airplane. There was some money she'd earned as a telephone operator, a truck driver, and all kinds of things she'd done in order to get this airplane.
In 1922, the year Amelia Earhart received her pilot's license, she started her climb to fame by setting her first record, an altitude record, and was well on her way to changing history.
But her first real brush with fame came when Amelia accepted a seat on the Friendship, a plane that crossed the Atlantic in 1928. The flight included 2 male aviators and Amelia. The public admired her bravery because back in the 20s you crossed the ocean on a boat, not a plane. That transatlantic flight set the stage for the rest of Amelia's career in the limelight on the next Kansas City Crossroads. I'm Bill Calaherka. Growing up in Atchison, Kansas, Amelia Earhart never stopped reaching for the skies. Her passion for adventure was evident even in those early days, when her dreams and endless spunk took her on many imaginary journeys. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. Today we pick up the story of Amelia on a very real journey across the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, not as the pilot, but yearning to be.
George Putnam, who became her husband later, was on the selection committee that found that she would be a person to go on the Friendship. So she was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger. Well, when she received such ovations there, everyone just thought this was wonderful that a woman was so brave to fly across the Atlantic, even as a passenger, in 1928. She said, I felt like a sack of potatoes. So she said, I want to do it myself. So she set out, and that was her goal, to actually fly the Atlantic alone. And that she did in 1932.
Amelia's flight across the Atlantic gave her celebrity status. Suddenly people were listening to her opinions about everything, from politics to commercial aviation.
It's much easier to fly the Atlantic Ocean now than it was a few years ago. I expect to be able to do it in my lifetime again. Possibly not as a solo expedition, but in regular transatlantic service, which is inevitable in our lifetime.
And today we know Amelia's premonitions were correct, but her historic flight across the Atlantic didn't satisfy her passion for adventure, so she decided to take on the world, or at least fly around it. But from the beginning, things didn't go as smoothly as she had hoped.
She was going to fly from California and go west around the world, and she flew as far as Hawaii. And there was a mishap as she took off.
So Amelia was forced to return to California and repair the plane. Weather conditions determined that she would now have to fly around the world heading east from California, leaving the most difficult part of her flight for the end, over the wide expanse of the Pacific.
She had almost made it, but she just didn't found the place she needed to be. And the mystery remains, and probably one of the great mysteries of today, although there are many people seeking that answer, is what happened to Amelia.
Amelia Earhart disappeared in 1937, but her legacy will never die.
I don't think there was any doubt that Amelia Earhart brought women into the 20th, 21st century and was a role model to many people who would never have dared to fly.
There's some people, that come through this world, like the great musicians, Beethoven and Mozart and all these people. And I think Amelia goes right in with that group of people, a very special person that was put here for a special reason.
Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. Here in the heart of Kansas City is a story about a young salesman from David City, Nebraska, who lived the American dream. He started off with 2 shoeboxes full of postcards and built a company whose name is recognized around the world.
Joyce C. Hall arrived in Kansas City in 1910 with dreams and ambition and 2 shoeboxes full of postcards. He rented a room at the Y and tucked those shoeboxes under his bed.
Mr. Hall did sell those postcards and things because that's what people wanted, was postcards.
After calling on local drugstores, bookstores, and gift shops, Hall ventured to towns along the railroad lines that passed through Kansas City. Soon the YMCA complained about the volume of mail the successful salesman was receiving, so young Hall moved to larger quarters. Business was growing by leaps and bounds until disaster struck on January 11th, 1915.
They had a terrible fire that just burned out the entire Valentine line that was ready to be shipped. Well, Mr. Hall is famous for turning a liability into an asset. I've seen him do it over and over and over. And what he did here was get a loan. A very kind man gave him the 2nd floor of his building downtown, and they reordered the Valentine line and got it shipped, and actually bought some engraving equipment and started making his own cards.
The company was $17,000 in debt, but there was no turning back. Hall was now creating his own designs, adding more employees, and making his mark on the greeting card industry. Hall always kept a close eye on the product that carried his name, approving each design. But even with a watchful eye on quality, sometimes things didn't always go as planned.
One of the most interesting was one that involved a little plant that could be sold, and then it would grow and be a nice gift. Well, somehow or other it got too warm, and in the warehouse I guess they all grew and bloomed before they were even out to be sold. So that was pretty much of a flop. Don't like to have too many of those.
Hallmark's remarkable success has drawn accolades and talent from all over the world.
Mr. Hall received a lot of honors for the Hallmark Hall of Fame. Directly, he received this first Emmy for the sponsor, and I'm sure others have been given since then, but he received the first one.
Today, Hallmark employs the world's largest creative staff and is one of the top privately owned companies in America, a giant in the greeting card industry, and a tribute to a man named Joyce. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Gardeners in the surrounding neighborhood are planting seeds here at the community garden at 21st and Brooklyn. They talk to each other over the plowed ground about the bountiful crop they expect this summer. But for 50 years, the sound echoing over these fields was the crack of a bat hitting a baseball and the roar of the crowd as Kansas City's hometown baseball team triumphed over the visiting team.
The first professional baseball team in town was the Cowboys, organized in 1884. Games were played on various ball diamonds around town.
Well, the Cowboys were a minor league team, and in fact, they started a ladies' day because it's such a rough crowd. They thought if they brought the ladies, it'd kind of calm them down.
By 1888, fans were calling the Cowboys the Blues because of the color of their uniforms. By 1917, brewer George Muehleback owned the controlling interest in the Blues. And in 1923, he built the city's first professional ballpark at 22nd and Brooklyn. The Blues played in the stadium for 32 years. In their heyday, Blues games attracted 30,000 cheering fans. The stadium was also the home of the Negro Leagues team, the Monarchs. They attracted as many for their games and were said to be a better team than the Blues, or even the New York Yankees.
In 1945, Satchel Paige and Jackie Robinson played on the same team here in Kansas City. The Monarchs were probably one of the premier black baseball teams of the time.
In 1937, the stadium and the Blues were sold to the New York Yankees as a farm minor league team. Bill Rizzuto, Hank Bauer, Yogi Berra, Roger Maris, and Mickey Mantle all played on the Blues team before going to the big leagues. Kansas City wanted a first league team, and in 1954 the Athletics came to town, putting an end to the Blues era. A second seating deck was added to the ballpark, and the name was changed to Municipal Stadium. At the first A's game in 1955, former President Harry Truman threw out the first ball. The team attracted more than 1.5 million fans that year.
For one whole spring and summer and early fall, the city talked about nothing except Major League Baseball. It gave everybody a sense of civic pride.
The second owner of the Athletics, Charlie Finley, didn't like Kansas City all that much, and in 1967 moved the team to Oakland, California. Kansas City was without a Major League ball team for 1 year, until Ewing Kauffman was awarded an American League franchise in 1968. The Royals and the Kansas City Chiefs football team played their home games in the old stadium until the Truman Sports Complex was completed in 1973.
In 1976, Municipal Stadium was demolished, and the land turned into a community garden. There are no crowds coming to the neighborhood now, and instead of bats and balls, those who come to this field bring hose and trowels. And the talk is not about the games of summer, but the harvest of summer. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. In the early days of Kansas City's fire service, a bucket and a neighborhood cistern were the most sophisticated firefighting tools around. A fire chief by the name of George Hale changed all that and brought Kansas City's firefighting teams worldwide acclaim.
Kansas City's early homes and businesses were built of wood, often close together, even sharing common walls. Because residents used candles and kerosene lanterns for light and they burned wood for cooking and heat, the danger of fire was always close at hand.
Fire was a very devastating kind of thing, not just to one building or one family, but a whole row or a whole block. And if it was a big enough fire and enough heat, it would jump a street and then start on the next street.
As the city grew, so did its need for a professional fire force. In 1882, Chief Hale took charge of the city's full-time firefighting force and drilled his men in speed and efficiency.
George was a speed freak. He wanted things to go fast. It's alleged that he invented the poles so that people could slide down and be faster. He invented the harnesses, the swinging harnesses, that the horses went to a particular place and the harnesses swung down and went right on and snapped on their necks. And as soon as the horses heard the snaps, they started on out the door, whether the wagon was hooked up or not.
Hale's impact on fire service was legendary around the world. Twice, Kansas City's team was selected to represent the United States at the International Fire Congress, where they won top honors. Hale's drills had worked. Kansas City's firemen could bunk out, dress in their protective gear, hitch up their horses, and get out of the station in a record 8.5 seconds, while their nearest competitor took well over a minute. But perhaps Hale's greatest legacy on the fire service industry came with his inventions. In addition to the swinging harness, his most famous invention was the Hale water tower, a hose attached to the top of an expanding ladder. Manufactured in Kansas City, the water towers were available in heights up to 60 feet and were shipped as far away as mainland China.
His theory was if you get into a building and you don't have water, well then you're only half there. So getting the water to the fire was a major part of what George did.
A competitive spirit has always burned in the hearts of firefighters. That drive to be the best at what he did drove George Hale to achieve significant firsts, leaving his mark on the Kansas City Fire Department for years to come.
First in is an honored position. You try to beat your buddy there, and get water on the fire first. That's all part of the service still today.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Colonel Thomas Swope, a shy, reclusive man, amassed a fortune in real estate and is most revered in Kansas City for the beautiful park that bears his name at Swope Parkway and Meyer Boulevard. But the circumstances surrounding his death led to the most dramatic murder trial in Kansas City history.
Colonel Swope, who never married, lived in his late brother's mansion in Independence, with his brother's widow, 5 nieces and nephews, and a cousin who managed the family's estate. In the fall of 1909, Colonel Swope, at age 82, is writing and rewriting his will. It has been more than a decade since he donated 1,300 acres to the city for Swope Park.
He had the idea that all of this money that was going to come to those nieces in particular was going to be the subject of fortune hunting by avarice men. And so that he thought, best we don't give these young ladies all of this money. And he talked about changing his will to put the money into charitable gifts.
But before he had the opportunity to change his will, Colonel Swope died while under the care of his niece's husband, Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde.
It was a Sunday morning. The doctor and his wife came to the household and delivered to the nurse a box of capsules and said, "This is some new medicine that I've prescribed for Colonel Swope."
At the time, no one suspected foul play. But as time passed, most of the Swope household came down with typhoid fever, and Colonel Swope's nephew, Chrisman, died. the nurses who cared for the Swope family began to grow suspicious of Dr. Hyde's methods of treatment.
They wanted to say that he caused the typhoid smell that the one son came down with, and indeed died from convulsions after a very short illness. They had done some testing on his body after they exhumed it also, and found some traces of cyanide.
The nurses' suspicions prompted the family to re-examine what caused Colonel Swope's death. They concluded that one person both had motive and opportunity. Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde was in line for a financial windfall if more family members died. So on March 11, 1910, a grand jury indicted Dr. Hyde for Colonel Swope's death. The case was tried 3 times at the Jackson County Courthouse. The first trial resulted in a conviction, only to be overturned by the state Supreme Court. The second ended in a mistrial. The third, a hung jury. Dr. Hyde was never convicted for the murder of Colonel Swope or any others in the family. Today, Kansas City will never forget the gift Colonel Swope gave us, and we will always be left to wonder what happened in that old mansion. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. At first, the rich, smoky air grabs your senses. The beef or pork or ribs are piled high on some plain white bread. Taste buds savor that first bite. The tangy sauce dribbles down your chin. It's barbecue time in Kansas City. You would think we had invented it, but we didn't. The truth is, people have been cooking meat over flame for at least 25,000 years. The evidence is there in archaeological digs. There are references in the Bible and in Homer's Iliad.
In Kansas City, barbecue is an art, a passion, and a slow-cooked institution. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, we take you to a place in the road where Kansas City got its first taste of barbecue in the 1920s from a man named Henry Perry, standing on the street corner here just east of downtown, selling ribs wrapped in newspaper.
By 1929, Mr. Perry was doing a brisk business in barbecued turkey, duck, pig, and goose. It didn't take long before Mr. Perry was showing others the art of coaxing flavor out of smoked meat. Folks like George Gates, Charlie Bryant, and his brother Arthur Bryant, who set up stands near the old Municipal Stadium.
That meant that people from all over the city, suburbs, urban, all ethnic groups, everybody came down to the ball games naturally, and when they were there, they couldn't help but smell that wonderful hickory smoke. And that's when Kansas City began to develop this heritage of great barbecue.
Kansas City's hands-on love affair with barbecue continued to grow, with neighborhood barbecue joints sprouting up all over the city. Each had its own style, perfecting the perfect barbecue sauce.
People talk about, well, the meat is the backbone of the barbecue. It's not. It's the sauce. It's 90% of your barbecue business.
Some like it tangy and sweet, some like it spicy and hot.
A lot of people feel that Kansas City has kind of been the melting pot of ideas in barbecue sauces because we have the spices and vinegar flavorings that come from the eastern coast, and then we have the cane sugar and molasses sweetness that came from the deep south. And when you put all those together with the Texas spices, you come up with what's kind of a Kansas City style sauce.
Today, nearly 80 barbecue restaurants dot the Kansas City landscape, earning us a spot on the national map as a barbecue mecca. Visitors make frequent pilgrimages to sample this culinary wonder.
You go anywhere, New York, California, any place, and if you tell them you're from Kansas City, the first thing you're going to say, I wish I could get there and get some of that good barbecue.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. You may not wonder about what your grandparents or great-grandparents did for fun in their youth. And if you do, you may think they did simple things like skipping a stone across the lake. But the fact is, turn-of-the-century Kansas City youngsters were looking for a thrill ride too, and they found it in a supercharged place called Electric Park.
It had rides, dancing, vaudeville theater, fountains, gardens, and lights. Lots and lots of lights. Electricity was new to Kansas City in 1899, and Electric Park turned night into day on 27 acres of the East Bottoms in Kansas City at Chestnut and Gannat Streets. It was built by Joe, Mike, and Fred Heim, brewers of Heim's beer. They originally built a streetcar line to bring thirsty Kansas Citians to their brewery, but beer alone wasn't enough. By building an amusement park, the Heims brought the whole family, the whole community together. Electric Park also attracted people from all over the Midwest. Eventually, Kansas City began to grow to the south, and Electric Park followed. The Heims abandoned their East Bottoms location and opened a much larger park at 47th and Paseo.
I was not aware, really, of how large it was, except when I got up in the Ferris wheel. And then it was really very striking, and especially at night where you'd see all the lights, and it really looked almost like daytime.
One of the biggest attractions of the new Electric Park was the nightly light and music show.
We'd beg my parents to let us stay till 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, these 4 or 5 statues would rise up out of the water, and they had lights playing on them. I thought that was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life.
Electric Park was masterful in the art of illusion. What Mrs. Oliver thought were statues were actually young women dressed in chiffon, emerging from the main fountains. The atmosphere under the 100,000 lights of Electric Park was magical for the young and young at heart. Whether riding the Dip coaster or doing the Charleston in one of the dance pavilions, Kansas Citians fell in love with the place.
I love the diversity of people. I love the feeling of seeing the barkers and seeing the clowns that would walk around. And just the feeling that somehow there was a wonderful community of just such different people.
Much of Electric Park was destroyed by fire in 1925. After repairs, the dance pavilion and the swimming pool remained open until 1934. Then fire struck again, and Electric Park went dark forever.
The impression was so great that every time I go down the Paseo, always I'd see Electric Park. I do today.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka.
There you go.
The rich colors of Kansas City's tapestry can be found here at the city market, where generations of farmers have brought fresh produce, first in buggies and wagons, then in pickup trucks. Since 1857, farmers have been sharing their bounty with us city folks.
Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. The activity around us today is very similar to what early settlers were doing more than 140 years ago in this space, gathering food for the family dinner table.
When the William Gillis family donated this land to Kansas City for use as a public square in 1846, it was initially used for circuses and political rallies. This was also the site of the first city hall and courthouse, but because of the town's location close to the river, it wasn't long before frontier families began stopping here to load up supplies.
The Santa Fe trade, which started at the river's end, came through this area. And just think of maybe 100 wagons coming through this exact area, pulled by oxen. Think of the smell and the noise, and just the spectacle of wagon upon wagon. One by one wagon would stretch out almost a mile, going south up the hills that we know today at 31st Street, how they ever managed that, and then cut across today Penn Valley Park and over to Indian Territory, which that's what it was called then, but it's the state of Kansas today.
The market was a lively place in those days, until the Civil War disrupted commerce.
So the town kind of died during the Civil War, except for the troops being here. But after the war, there was a resurgence, mainly because of the Hannibal Bridge. It brought more people here on trains, and the market just survived. There's a wonderful picture that I have seen, which is dated 1870, and you can see all the buggies all around this square. So you can just imagine that it was a continual place to buy and sell and make money and exchange goods, and a friendly place that you could exchange information.
After the Depression, the market faced another crossroads. With federal money from the Roosevelt administration to help put people back to work, permanent buildings and covered walkways were added to the site. And in 1990, another facelift added brick courtyards. A few farmers today continue those traditions started in 1857, rising early and bringing loads of fresh produce to the heart of the city.
I do think that there is a uniqueness, probably because of those people whose mother and father and grandparents came down here, and they just really feel ownership of this market.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Well, I started playing it when I was a kid, and I just got fascinated with it. You know, and I love to play, boy, I really did.
Thousands of young Kansas City ball players have rounded the bases at diamonds like this one over the course of our city's history. Dreams of the big leagues were in the minds of many, including a young man born in 1905 by the name of Pat Nolan.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Pat Nolan loved the game, but like so many others, he never realized his dream of playing in the major leagues. But he did become a pro at nurturing talent. And for the last 50 years, as hundreds of Kansas City youngsters arrived at the crossroads of their would-be baseball careers, Pat Nolan has been standing there, ready to help them make their dreams come true.
Pat Nolan is a legend in Kansas City baseball. He was one of the founders of the 3-2 League, originally created back in 1944, giving the sons of World War II soldiers the opportunity to play while their fathers were at war. Then in 1947, Pat began to work with older players in the Van Johnson League, college-age players who were then and are now serious about the game. Pat has always been as serious as his players, and just as honest about their chances of going to the majors.
I had a lot of kids. I told them, get out. You're just spinning your wheels. I said, get out if you got a college education. Well, I try to guide them in the right direction. I really do. Well, if I think they got a chance, I'll tell them. I said, hang in or you might make it.
A couple of the players Pat told to hang in there were Joe Presco, formerly of the St. Louis Cardinals, and David Cohn of the New York Yankees.
Well, Joe Presco was the first one. He weighed 140 pounds. He was pitching for the St. Louis Cardinals. So did BB's. Well, his two sons played for me, but he had the desire. He signed one out.
His head has been in the game for more than 80 years, a coach for more than 40 of those. His formula for success is uncomplicated. No one succeeds on his team without hard work.
I always tell all the kids that come with me, all you're going to get out of it is what you put in it. And if you do that, you're going to be pretty good. That's all I tell them.
Pat Nolan retired from baseball in 1985, only to find that he couldn't leave. Baseball was in his blood. And now, 13 years later at age 92, watching and helping young players make it to the pros still keeps Pat suiting up for games at the Van Johnson League.
You're my boy, Fred.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Before every family had a television set, and long before professional sports arrived in Kansas City, families came here to Starlight Theatre for entertainment. For 11 weeks in the summertime of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, these seats were filled to capacity for theater under the stars.
In 1949, Kansas City was looking for a site to hold its centennial pageant, so a hard-working centennial committee added funds to post-war bonds to begin construction of Kansas City's outdoor theater in Swope Park. The first performance on Starlight stage was Thrills of a Century on June 3, 1950. Hundreds of local residents participated in the pageant, and thousands more came to applaud.
Everybody in Kansas City came, I think. My sister and I were dressed as Statues of Liberty, and then we just paraded over these mounds of dirt.
The pageant's success convinced the park board that outdoor theater in Kansas City was a good idea, and the city council approved more funds. Though neighboring St. Louis had an outdoor theater with a larger seating capacity, Starlight was built with a bigger stage. In fact, the largest outdoor stage in the country. Starlight's immense scenery wagons also made the record books. Measuring 10 by 36 feet long and 18 feet high, they were mounted on huge casters, requiring a crew of men to roll them into position. Opening night of Starlight's inaugural season was June 25, 1951, when the curtain opened for The Desert Song. In the early years of Starlight Theater, the season was 11 weeks long, with musicals running each week. Perennial favorites included The Music Man and The Wizard of Oz, shows that featured many of Kansas City's youngest stars. The schedule demanded the best from both performers and crew, but the outdoor setting proved equally challenging.
We did get bugs, especially we had lights that came on to us like this, and the bugs would just be out there, especially if it had rained or something that came up. The singers had terrible time because if you opened your mouth, you'd probably swallow some. And then they say, oh, go on, keep going.
In spite of the risks inherent with outdoor theater, the crowds came.
In the early days, Starlight Theater was the place to go. It was nothing to have a sellout at Starlight Theater. Almost every show out here was almost a sellout. Then we went through a real dry spell, and hard times hit. And it just seemed like we just couldn't get people to come out to Starlight Theater anymore. But I think it's coming back. A lot of people have done a lot of things right, and I think they've built it back up to where people enjoy coming out here.
Outdoors, it's just a marvelous theater. I hope it's always here.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
In 1894, when farmers looked at the landscape here at 36th and Gillum, they saw grazing land for cattle. But a group of British and Scottish settlers saw the perfect place for a game from their homeland. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, we walk the course of history through the eyes of the Kansas City golfer.
A group of the early affluent people of Kansas City lived around Hyde Park, and they had a club called the Hyde Park Country Club, also called the Hyde Park Tennis Club, and out of that little club, which had been founded, I think, in 1892, came the Kenwood Golf Links in 1894.
With only 5 holes, the Kenwood Golf Links didn't look that much different than it did when it was a pasture land. In fact, a golfer's hazards still included cows, deer, and the occasional scoff from tennis players from the club. But the attitudes quickly changed.
Golf became so important that they decided to abandon that club, come to another location. They got on bikes, drove all through here on their bikes, and decided this was an ideal place.
This ideal place was what is now Luce Park. And by 1899, Kansas City had its first 18-hole golf course.
It was a lot shorter than today's courses. The equipment was less sophisticated. It was much harder to get a ball up and down on the greens in those days. It wasn't a Pebble Beach, but it was a wonderful golf course for its time.
Course maintenance was important, even in those days.
Early on, they used sheep, and there's evidence that they used sheep here too, to keep the rough down and to maintain the course.
As the years passed, golf grew, and by 1906, Kansas City had its first public course.
In September of 1906, the professional at the Kansas City Country Club got together with the professional at Evanston, whose name was Jim Dalgleish, and who is regarded as the father of golf in Kansas City. And they started pushing the park department to use Swope Park for a golf course, which happened in 3 weeks and $200 or $300.
By the 1920s, there were 25,000 golfers in Kansas City. And with the exception of World War II, when play nearly halted here and elsewhere, the game of golf has been growing. Today, there are nearly 70 courses in the Kansas City area, on par with the passion of Kansas City's first lovers of the game. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. We live in a city of generous people. In our 150-year history, there have been countless acts of kindness and goodwill from people rich and poor. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, the story of two sisters born in the mid-1800s who dedicated their lives to the healing of children.
Dr. Alice Berry Graham, a dentist, and Dr. Catherine Berry Richardson, a physician, lived during a perilous time for children in Kansas City.
The plight of children in the 1890s, particularly with the westward expansion of the country, posed several problems. Childhood illness, infant death were significant issues. Many of the medicines and treatments that we know today have not really emerged. There were also a great number of children who in that period of time were born into homes where they simply couldn't be cared for. Many of them existed often in a street environment.
So starting with a single bed in 1897, Graham and Richardson began to save those children from the street and developed the Free Bed Fund Association for sick, crippled, deformed, and ruptured children, renting bed space wherever they could and counting on the kindness of strangers.
She very much felt that the contributions needed to be from the individuals of the community. The strength of the movement was very much dependent upon the support of the community, and so they looked towards the individual participants. No gifts were too small.
By 1904, their grassroots movement grew into Mercy Hospital.
In front of the old hospital on Highland Avenue, they used to keep a board in which they daily put out the list of needs for the hospital: dozen eggs, case of milk, linens, and the hopes that people who went by would contribute.
Mercy Hospital grew each year. Then in 1913, as the two sisters considered expanding to a larger hospital, Dr. Graham passed away.
The cornerstone that now lies in that hospital carries an inscription which dedicates the hospital to Dr. Graham and to the notion that the hospital will forever be a hospital in which anybody can come for care regardless of their background or their ability to pay. The doors would be open to everyone.
Today, Children's Mercy Hospital, located on Hospital Hill, continues the legacy of Dr. Graham and Dr. Richardson, two sisters who unselfishly gave a generation of Kansas City children their healing hands and open hearts, and taught us all how to give.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Establishing a school for the children of Kansas City's frontier families was the vision of Father Bernard Donnelly, a priest who believed passionately in education. In December of 1865, Father Donnelly dispatched a letter to St. Louis, asking the Mother General of the Sisters of St. Joseph to send a few teachers to Kansas City to start an academy for young ladies. 6 sisters came, and on August 4th, 1866, they opened the doors of the city's first school, and they called it St. Teresa's Academy.
Catholics and Protestants had asked for a school to be started here in Kansas City for the girls. Also, there was no economic line. Rich and poor were accepted and treated equally. We had French people, we had English people, we had Americans, we had Spanish people. So it was very ecumenical even at that time, which I think is wonderful, and it continues to this day.
This bell echoed over the bluffs at Quality Hill, summoning the young students to school. Enrollment was brisk from the very first day, as more families settled in this growing metropolis overlooking the Missouri River. Young ladies came not only from Kansas City, but from neighboring towns in Kansas and Missouri.
It was built as a school where children could be housed and boarded because the parents lived too far away. They couldn't really bring their children daily.
Iron gates were installed and locked promptly at 8 p.m. to protect the girls from the brawling city and to keep out gunmen, gamblers, and undesirables like Jesse James. In 1910, the sisters and students said goodbye to Quality Hill and followed the city's migration southward. Sister Evelyn O'Neill relocated the academy to the Winmore campus on the present site at 5600 Main.
Winmore is the title that she gave it because of all of the wind that you felt on this campus at the time. It was so strong and still is.
Early curriculum included the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and also chemistry, languages, instrumental music, needlework, and the making of artificial flowers.
They wore uniforms at that time, as the girls still do today. They wore black dresses, black alpaca, and they had black hats with a little red ribbon around it.
When the sisters added the College of St. Teresa in 1916, the academy clearly became a college preparatory school. By 1962, the college had outgrown the facilities on Main Street and had moved to 119th and Warnell with a new name, Avila College. Now, with more space at 5600 Main, the enrollment at St. Teresa's Academy doubled. Continued growth marked the 1970s and 80s, as more parents wanted an all-girls school for their daughters.
Today, St. Teresa's Academy holds the distinction of being the oldest school west of the Mississippi, still operating as an academy for young women. Quite a legacy to those courageous Sisters of St. Joseph, who first introduced education to this bustling city on the bluffs. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Imagine a time when there was no such thing as a supermarket. We simply picked up a telephone and told a friendly voice from the neighborhood grocer what we needed to fill the pantry. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. 100 years ago, many Kansas Citians had their groceries delivered to their door, courtesy of Fred Wolferman's Good Things to Eat. In 1888, Louis Wolferman bought his first grocery store at 9th and Oak in downtown Kansas City. Named after his son Fred, his growing business soon moved into a two-story building at 1108 Walnut.
1108 Walnut building was just darn near like a city in itself. Had 4 restaurants in there, had the grillette in the basement, and they had the fountain on the first floor, and they had the balcony around the store, and had the tiffin room upstairs. And they could seat 600 people at a time.
And of course, it had groceries. Originally, big red horse-drawn wagons maneuvered through mud streets to deliver the goods. In 1914, the horses were retired to make way for turtleback roadsters. And then a fleet of panel trucks made the rounds of Kansas City's neighborhoods, delivering good things to eat.
People would call in, and each sales girl had a list of people that they took care of. Someone would call, or the girl would call the customer at 9 o'clock and call the next customer at 9:10. And then the order went to the order room and was filled and went out on delivery. Friday and Saturday to deliver 1,200 to 1,800 orders a day from each store.
It wasn't long before Mr. Wolferman opened stores in Westport, the Plaza, and at 59th and Main. At that Brookside store, the legendary Wolferman's Muffin was born.
The original English muffin rings were made out of iron, and they were so heavy that the bakers hurt their arms. They were too heavy to turn. So then we started using aluminum rings.
Though the muffins were an instant hit, home deliveries were Mr. Wolferman's bread and butter.
For the Second World War, about 80% of our business was delivery. And after the World War, then we had to go into self-service. And our stores were pretty small for self-service.
Wolferman's found itself at a crossroads. The war had changed people's shopping habits, and supermarkets began to dot the suburban landscape. By 1972, Fred Wolferman Jr., great-grandson of the founder, closed the restaurants and grocery stores and decided to specialize in a mail-order business. Today, the company is no longer owned by the Wolferman family, but its good things to eat are still delivered to households around the country. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka.
Some of the most vivid memories from early 20th century Kansas City came in round metal canisters from Hollywood. Movies sparked the imagination of young and old. Motion picture theaters were neighborhood gathering places. And as screens began to light up across Kansas City, one theater stood out. Not necessarily for the comfortable seats or concessions, or even for the movies it showed, but because of the way it brought people together. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, we reflect back on the silver screen and the magic of the Gem Theater.
Between the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, I mean, this was a place where, as they say, it was all happening. There were nightclubs and hotels and restaurants and, of course, jazz clubs. And this was the place.
The place was 18th and Vine, and the Gem Theater was right in the heart of the action, even for preschoolers.
My first memory of the Gem Theater goes back to even before I started school, because I lived around the corner, 1818 Woodlands, so my friends, they would bring me around here when I was a baby to the Gem Theater. That's where they had the serials, the cowboy movies. They had every kind of movie that you could think of right here at the Gem Theater.
Because of segregation, there were only a few theaters in the African American community where African Americans could attend. The Gem Theater was one of those. And for that reason, it had great value for blacks. Even though it showed second-run westerns, it was a place where African Americans could go, could congregate to be in the 18th and Vine district, and that is what made it so special.
If we wanted to take our girl out, we'd probably take her to the Lincoln Theater or something like that. But this was a hangout. This is where we come, because we could come and see our cowboy movies and see all the, we used to call them the shoot 'em up. We go into the shoot 'em up. And I knew all of the Sons of the Pioneer songs. She be coming around the mountain when she comes. And that's one of them. And then, I'm back in the saddle again, out where a friend is a friend. You know, and then there's another one, take me back to Tulsa, I'm too young to marry. Take me back to Tulsa, I'm too young to marry. Walk and talk, Susie. Walk and talk, Susie. Walk and talk, Susie. Walk and talk with Susie.
With desegregation came new opportunities for African Americans, and the magic of the Gem began to fade. In 1960, the screens went dark. But today, a newly renovated Gem Theater stands as one of the cornerstones of the revived 18th and Vine district.
I'm real happy to see that it's back. Maybe they might bring some old cowboy movies back. I don't know.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka.
Kansas City Crossroads is a production of NBC 41, proud to bring you the stories of the people and events that have shaped our rich heritage. The following is a special presentation of NBC 41.
Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka. Welcome to NBC 41's Kansas City Crossroads Volume 2. We've put together 2 hours of stories about the people, places, and events that have helped shape the history of our city. From the heyday of Kansas City's passenger railroad service to ice delivery to your door. From the simple brushes of an amazing artist to all-night parties at the edge of the United States, just off State Line Road in 1843. So sit back and enjoy NBC 41's Kansas City Crossroads, Volume 2.
Woven through time, a tapestry of stories defines who we are and gives us a sense of place. From NBC 41, this is Kansas City Crossroads.
On November 1st, 1921, 200,000 people gathered here to dedicate this site to the memory of those who died in World War I. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. That November day in 1921 also marked the beginning of a remarkable chapter in our city's history, when thousands of people united in one effort to build a national monument, the Liberty Memorial.
They raised $2.5 million in less than 2 weeks. It was a wonderful thing to think about, that there was that kind of patriotism in the community where 83,000 people would donate money to create the memorial. When construction started on the Liberty Memorial in 1923, a lot of the power was actually supplied by mules and horses. A lot of labor, a lot of people worked on the memorial over the 2.5 years while it was being constructed. The original dedication of the memorial itself, when it was completed, was November 11th, Armistice Day of 1926. Again, probably 200,000 people were here. You look at the photographs of that dedication and it's just everywhere. It's just a sea of people.
Those people came to marvel at this limestone-covered tower that rises 217 feet above ground. And atop this grand monument to those who fought and died in World War I are 4 guardian spirits who symbolize courage, honor, patriotism, and sacrifice.
To me, it's like hallowed ground. It's more or less hallowed ground because this is a monument to a lot of nice guys that are gone. You know, some were killed in the war, like people like my dad who lived through the war, although they were wounded and gassed and then died later.
At the end of the long mall, 2 sphinxes grace the entrance to the courtyard.
The one that faces east is called Memory, and it's to remember the men and women who served in the war. You look at them, you'll see that it has its eyes covered, and that's just against the horrors of the battlefield, so we don't remember those. The one on the other side is called Future, and it's really for Kansas City. It's because Kansas City for many years was a place where people came to go off to their future in the West, and it has its eyes covered symbolically against the unseen future.
Though its future is at a critical crossroads, the monument stands as a tribute to our past.
The names in bronze on the wall in Memory Hall at the Liberty Memorial represent the 441 Kansas Citians who died during the war. And so those names are probably the most important part of the memorial, is that those are the people it was really built for, and those are the people that it still stands for.
Rusting iron, tattered bits of fabric, and scraps of plywood. These remains are a forgotten part of aviation history, resting here in a field near Kansas City, Kansas. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, the story of World War II gliders and the amazing men who flew them on a wing and a prayer.
Between Civil War horses and modern-day helicopters, there were gliders.
It was real interesting flying gliders, especially this bird here. This was designed for a combat situation, designed to carry either infantrymen in here or a howitzer or a Jeep trailer full of ammunition. or a Jeep. And this nose section here is hinged at the top. If you had a Jeep in here, it would be hooked up to cable back there. And when you landed, you could disconnect the nose and drive the Jeep out.
Weighing 7,000 pounds when fully loaded, the gliders were pulled into the air by tow planes, reaching speeds up to 150 miles per hour.
They had a little formula. You figure out, but the people that used that formula all got killed. You had to just get so you look out and you could see. You see a field out here, and you just had to know by experience that you could make it. And just had to, it's what's called flying by the seat of your pants.
The lucky pilots walked away from those perilous landings. Many did not.
I saw a number of these crashed and all beat up in Normandy. Well, I think they averaged 4 casualties per landing. The trees, poles, the wires and all that sort of thing were what actually caused the casualties.
The risky strategy for delivering troops and supplies was called vertical envelopment.
An example of that was in the invasion of Normandy. Now, at Utah Beach, we dropped paratroopers and gliders back behind the beach, and we started attacking the Germans, disrupting communications, blowing up bridges, doing all kinds of things, and completely disorganized their resistance at Utah Beach. So it was obvious that the vertical envelopment back behind Utah Beach was extremely effective.
Though their effectiveness is undisputed, glider pilots are sometimes called the forgotten heroes of World War II. To make sure their heroic efforts are not forgotten, former glider pilots and aviation enthusiasts are preserving history at Whiteman Air Force Base in Knob Noster, Missouri. Affectionately called the Glider Gang, they will restore a CG-4A glider and establish a museum to honor those men who risked everything so they could fly. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. There was a time shortly after World War II when every 7th woman in the United States wore a dress made in Kansas City. One of the coveted labels belonged to a well-dressed and gracious lady who revolutionized the garment industry. Her name was Nell Donnelly Reed, and her Nellie Don label was known around the world.
Nell Donnelly believed a woman should always look her best. The common, shapeless house dresses didn't suit her sense of style, so she made her own.
She made a lot of clothes, and when she would go out to do her washing, the neighbors would see her clothes that she was wearing, and they admired them and wanted to know if they could have something as attractive as she was wearing.
In 1916, after much encouragement from friends and family, she took samples of her dresses to a Kansas City retailer who liked what he saw and ordered 18 dozen.
She hired 2 neighbors to help her sew, and they had them ready in 2 weeks and took 216 dresses back to George Peck and Company, where they were sold out by noon. And from that grew one of the largest apparel companies in the world. She employed eventually between 1,000 and 1,300 people in the Kansas City area.
By 1931, what had begun in Nell's attic had grown to a $3.5 million business. Nellie Don's dresses were reasonably priced and, most of all, attractive.
They were feminine, they were pretty, they had ruffles, they weren't ugly or plain anymore, and she had unique styles. As I said, she called them bungalow aprons rather than a house dress. They were pretty enough to wear anywhere, not just out to do the washing. She could wear them to the store or whatever, take the streetcar anywhere, and you felt halfway dressed up.
While making her mark on the women's ready-to-wear industry, she also pioneered innovations in the workplace.
In many of the garment companies, a lady probably made collars all day long, or sleeves, or just one particular item. But in Nellie Don's factory, a group would put a whole outfit together so that they saw what the finished product looked like, and many of the workers always knew where the dresses were going, who had bought them, and where they were being shipped overseas or here in the United States. She was always kind, she was always considerate, and her employees came first. She felt that if their working conditions were good, they would put out a good product and would be productive.
Nell Donnelly Reed's factory was one of 86 factories like this one that draped the Kansas City garment district in its heyday, when 8,000 people worked here. She retired in 1956 before overseas competition brought the industry to a crossroads. By the mid-1970s, her garment factory in Kansas City had closed its doors, leaving Nellie Don dresses stitched in time. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Somewhere between the oxen-pulled Conestoga wagon and modern air travel lies a ribbon of steel in Kansas City history. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Back in 1887, a gentleman named Arthur Stillwell gave us our own homegrown railroad, the Kansas City Southern Railway. It began as a mover of freight, but by the time it introduced the Southern Bell in 1940, it had mastered the art of moving people.
You must remember that we took young people off the farms and off the streets, put them in uniform, and maybe perhaps for the first time in their lives, they traveled by train. Many had never traveled by train before. This was the prelude, so to speak, to the big surge in railroad travel after World War II.
Passengers added additional revenues to the railroads, but it was always freight service that carried the financial load.
Here comes a double-header freight train, headed for the sunny south.
Back in those days, Kansas City was, and in some respects still is, the #2 rail center in the United States. But there were 12 railroads serving Kansas City at that time, in each of which operated passenger trains in and out of Kansas City.
All aboard!
Families especially enjoyed the amenities offered on a passenger train.
It gave children a chance to roam. They don't have that on an airplane today. There was a dining car available. You could eat a meal for a reasonable price, and that was something that Kansas City Southern always boasted about. It didn't cost you an arm and a leg to eat on the train and to sit there and watch the countryside go by.
Right after the Southern Bell came on, passenger service exploded. This went on for some time, and then all of a sudden we came to the crossroads. People then decided that they could start flying. Airfare became much cheaper, the volume started to pick up, and people found out that their time was much more valuable, and consequently they'd be willing to pay the extra money in order to ride on the plane rather than on the train.
Then as the highway system developed and automobiles became more luxurious, and you could come and go where you wanted, when you wanted, that was a competitive factor the railroads couldn't contend with.
On November 3, 1969, the Southern Bell made its final run into Union Station, the end of the line and the end of an era. But Kansas City Southern survived the death of passenger service. The little railroad that could thrives today with an increasingly successful freight business. And a restored Southern Bell still courts the rails. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Dear Mom, I'm going to Handicraft Lodge. The river is up, so we can't go swimming. I have some poison ivy. Somebody stole most of my candy, so don't send me any more. Please send some shorts and socks. Love, Robert.
Some traditions in scouting never change. Though that postcard was written in 1933, it could have been written this summer by any of the 6,000 scouts attending camp in Osceola, Missouri. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. For a young man growing up in Kansas City in the 1930s, Scout Camp was a 2-week adventure filled with swimming, horseback riding, and lessons around the campfire. That rich tradition of Scout Camp was started by a lawyer named H. Roe Bartle, whose heart matched the size of his 6'6" frame.
Mr. Bartle was very dynamic Scout executive. It's hard to describe him.
He was brilliant. He had boundless energy, fabulous voice, deep bass.
I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country and to obey.
I have heard him when we had our Boy Scout roundups in the arena of the Municipal Auditorium with the floor completely filled with scouts, stop the grand entry and lead in the Pledge of Allegiance without the PA system.
And with the scout sign over our hearts, reverently we pray together.
Really built scouting in Kansas City to what it is. And the camp here and the tribe of Mickosay, which he started, is what keeps the young men coming back year after year after year.
In the early years, scouts were awakened by a bugler playing reveille into a megaphone. After flag raising, scouts enjoyed a variety of activities, but swimming was a particular favorite.
The whistle blows and the swim's on.
The scouts always keeping a close eye on their buddies.
Each scout holds the hand of his buddy aloft as the lifeguard checks to make sure all is well.
And of course, they worked on merit badges.
There is no more valuable method of education than learning by doing.
The merit badges were pretty much the same that were offered here at camp. A lot of the older ones no longer exist, like blacksmithing and masonry and poultry keeping, such as that. But they had bird hikes early in the morning if they were taking bird study merit badge, and went out looking for snakes on reptile study, just like they do now.
Today, interest in scouting is again on the upswing.
The Boy Scouts have held very strongly to belief in God, keeping yourself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight, and have continued to push those ideals and stand by them. And I think that's one reason why a lot of parents are encouraging their boys to be scouts. And let's face it, they have a lot of fun too.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherka.
My grandfather was raised on a farm in northern Missouri, and I think he had always maintained a love for the land, and so it was important for him to have a place to get away from the city and kind of get back to his roots. My favorite spot is the Rock and Waterfall Garden. Not only because I think it's a particularly beautiful setting, but as I used to come out here with my grandfather at a very young age, I used to build forts along the creek where that garden now is situated. You know, it's just a paradise. Our primary purpose was to fill a need that we saw for Kansas City. I think at the same time, if my grandfather were here today, that he would be very proud of what we've accomplished here. I think this is a very good use for the land that he originally provided for us.
Here at the world's longest water bar in Excelsior Springs, people drank water that many believed had healing powers. Hello, I'm Bill Callagher for Kansas City Crossroads. The elixir bubbled up all over town. At one time, more than 46 springs and wells were located within 1 mile of this place that visitors reverently called the Hall of Waters.
Excelsior Springs was founded in 1880, and it was founded for the simple reason of the water. They tested it, and it was called iron manganese. It was an incredible water, and the reason it could heal so many different things is that it was the right combination of iron that your system needed, but manganese helps your system assimilate iron much easier. So that's the reason it could work on so many different ailments.
As word spread about the amazing water, people came by the thousands to drink from the springs.
Many businessmen from Kansas City saw the potential here, and by 1888 they had plans for a first-class hotel, which is what the Elms turned out to be, and they planned a neighborhood around it. Well, they were afraid they were going to run out of water, so they started to dig other springs. And as they started to do that, they kept finding different kinds of waters, and they were surprised, until finally they had found 5 kinds of water. Now, in 1935, when they decided to create the mineral water system and clean up the town, what they did was they made it illegal to take a bath without a prescription. So you had to come here and go to the doctor and have your condition checked out. And according to whatever the doctor found, he gave you a prescription that said, first of all, how many baths you would take and in what order and how long they would last, how much water you would drink. You would get a prescription for the kinds of water that you would have, the different times of day you would drink those water and how much of them. So they came back and they built this incredible facility that included 2 full bathhouses, the world's longest water bar, 3 swimming pools, a bottling plant, and the sales offices and support and staff that they needed. It was built to be the best health facility in the United States, and they called it the Haven of Health.
During the 1930s and 40s, the town boasted more than 500,000 visitors each year. Then in the 1960s, doctors were prohibited from advertising their services.
When they were no longer able to advertise, and there was no other organized group in Excelsior Springs, no other industry in Excelsior Springs to pick up that slack or to continue to advertise the town. So everything just kind of went to sleep.
After a 30-year rest, Excelsior Springs is enjoying a renaissance, with people revisiting the restored hotels and bathhouses, and of course, drinking the water. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callagher. The first wheat seeds of Kansas traveled all the way from Russia in burlap sacks carried by Mennonite farmers. After perfecting the art of growing hard red winter wheat in their homeland, the Mennonites brought their hardy turkey red seed to Kansas.
Hello, I'm Bill Callagher for Kansas City Crossroads. In 1870, the railroad companies wanted to build communities along their tracks. And so they traveled far and wide, spreading the word about this fertile land in the Midwest. Russian Mennonites listened, and soon they were arriving by the dozens, their hearts full of hope to this land filled with promise.
Well, of course, wheat is a basic food for making of bread, and wheat being a plant that is a dry weather plant, it takes hot weather and survives those conditions. It was really a boon to Kansas because Kansas was considered, western Kansas particularly, was just a great desert as it was just termed at that time. Mennonites, of course, were very thrifty people, and they saved the seed and distributed it out to other farmers around, and just, from there it grew. And Turkey Red was practically the only wheat that was planted in the early 1900s from then on. And I can remember when my father was raising wheat, practically all of the bottom land that we had then, we raised wheat on. And I can remember the shocks all over the bottom. It was always quite a sight. And then when after we thrashed, the straw stacks. And that was in the mid-30s. Back at that time, we, of course, was cutting wheat with a binder and shocking it. And I got the job of being the water boy, and I had a little spotted pony and carried water around to all the shockers, and also when we were thrashing to the pitchers. When I came back from college, of course, that was all over and we was all mechanized. After the self-propels and the semi-trucks and all, now we're seeing this harvest done. The weather cooperates with the custom cutters, and they can come in and cut this 10 million acres of wheat we raise in Kansas in probably 2 weeks' time or less. That reduces the risk of losing it to hail, bad weather, and what have you. When you're involved in agriculture 100% like we are, there is a certain amount of satisfaction that we are doing some good, and that hopefully we're helping people to survive and providing them the good, wholesome food that this land has to produce. So I don't know any other industry that I'd rather be in than agriculture, because I think of these unique features that we have in farming, and particularly in the good earth.
In the early days of Kansas City aviation, pilots landed here at what used to be a muddy field at the north end of the Hannibal Bridge. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. One of those pilots was Charles Lindbergh, and his visit to Kansas City on a summer's day in 1927 attracted thousands of people who wanted a glimpse of this dashing hero and his flying machine.
There is the opportunity today for any one of a number of cities in this country to become the air center of the country.
Charles Lindbergh dedicated this airport in 1927. So he flew the Spirit of St. Louis into Kansas City, and he made between 7 and 9 passes, I've heard several varieties of this, to land on the field. And each time he'd come in to land, it was either too muddy to land, or there was people in the middle of the field, or the wind was wrong. So he finally got it on the ground, and when you look at the pictures, you can see that the mud in the field was a foot deep. So all those people stomping through the field made it very difficult to operate an airplane. Things got more sophisticated towards the end of the late 20s, so they came up with airplanes that were capable of transporting passengers. And Kansas City happens to be one of the first major hubs in the United States, because the east-west routes and the north-south routes came through Kansas City. Because Kansas City already was a major railroad hub, it was natural for it to be an aviation hub as well. It wasn't long before Kansas City's municipal airport offered service from all the major air carriers. After the war, airplanes were faster, bigger, and we're talking 100 people on an airplane now versus 20 and 30 people previously.
X-ray clear for takeoff, 320 at 10 to 15.
We started going transcontinental and then transoceanic. We had the Connie up here that we have on the airport. It was the first airplane that could go nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean. Passengers who traveled in the 50s wore their Sunday best because traveling was considered a special occasion, which often included a meal at the airport cafe.
Its downtown location has made Municipal one of the most accessible airports in the United States.
In the heyday of the downtown airport, there was about 2 million passengers a year went through here. If you want to try to put that in perspective with today, KCI runs about 11 million passengers. So this place would be a little bit of bedlam if we still had the operation still running out of here. Today, the planes flying in and out of downtown airport are mostly corporate jets, following the path of aviation pioneers like Charles Lindbergh, who taught us these amazing machines really could fly. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Remember when your parents used to tell you about the days they walked to school in 2 feet of snow? Many of those stories could have started at Lansfield School, out here on the Kansas prairie about 10 miles from the county seat in Olathe. Operating as a one-room schoolhouse for 93 years, Lansfield School taught many youngsters the joys of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, Teresa Weaver takes us back to an October day in 1904.
Dear Mother and Father, I'm writing at the end of a busy school day. I never imagined that being a one-room school teacher could be so difficult. Let me tell you about a typical school day at Lansfield. I ring the bell at about 8:30. The school children arrive at 9 after their walk to school. We say the pledge, and then I assign the students their first lesson of the day. Usually, I'll bring the first graders up to the recitation bench first, and we might work on reading or arithmetic.
The wind has your soft, downy nest disturbed.
It is difficult to orchestrate 18 students in 8 different grades, all in one schoolroom. At any given time, I might have 5 students at the blackboard working on their arithmetic, 3 or 4 working on penmanship, 2 or 3 working on reading, another doing geography, and I have to make sure they're all learning those lessons. So it is quite difficult, but somehow, with discipline and order, we keep the school running.
Come on, you guys!
We have 2 recess periods during the day, and sometimes I play with the kids outside during recess. I have heard that it does gain their respect when you do so. And we play baseball, 2 cats, Annie over the schoolhouse, things like that. It took almost 2 months to travel. I think for tomorrow's geography lesson for the 4th graders, we'll discuss the Santa Fe Trail. The trail actually passed very close by the school, and from what I hear, the children really enjoyed running to the school windows just to watch the last wagons pass down the trail on their way to Santa Fe. Of course, the building of the railroad brought an end to all of the busy traffic that went through the town of Lansfield. Now this school is all that remains of the town of Lansfield and the Santa Fe Trail traffic that once went through here. But it's never quiet at Lansfield. The school year here is from October until April, which is organized around the harvest season, of course. School ends at 4 and I ring the bell and the children run home. Well, dear parents, I must sign off. There certainly remains a lot of work to be done inside the school. I miss you and I will see you in a few weeks. With love, Teresa.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. When it opened in 1927, the Playmore was the largest indoor recreation center in the country. Kansas Citians came to the Playmore to go bowling, to shoot pool, to go swimming, ice skating, roller skating, and of course, to go dancing.
On opening night, 500 couples romanced their way across the floor.
I don't think there was any other ballroom close to this one that had the advantages of the floor in this ballroom. There were 16,000 square feet of dancing space with 7,800 cushioned springs under the floor so that you didn't get tired while you were dancing. I can remember dancing a whole evening, every single dance, and going home feeling wonderful.
Located on 8 acres from Main to Wyandotte Streets at 31st Terrace, the Playmore attracted immense crowds. Many people danced to the popular music of the day, performed live by entertainment legends such as Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Welk, and Count Basie. and couples sometimes danced until the wee hours of the morning.
In the ballroom, they had the dance marathons. That was about in '39, those were so popular. People would throw money on the floor for their favorite couple, but it was the couple that lasted the longest that won the prize, and they would just be kind of hanging on each other dancing.
The Playmore lived up to its name, treating Kansas Citians to every sport from roller derbies to billiards. The Playmore bowling team competed nationally, and the Ice Palace was home to the city's first professional hockey team. The public ice rink operated from December through March, when it was transformed into an indoor swimming pool, complete with a sand beach in an adjoining parking lot. For nearly 4 decades, generations of Kansas Citians grew up at the Playmore. Then the 50s arrived with its rock and roll and television. Attendance at the Playmore began to drop.
I think probably television took away from our crowds, like for hockey games, for instance. If they could get it on TV, the crowds dropped tremendously. Of course, it was only black and white at that time, where we used to have at least 5,000 people, to watch a hockey game. It would drop to around 3,500, which made a big difference.
Activities gradually dwindled, but there was still no other place in town like the Playmore for dancing. Eventually, the 50s took its toll on ballroom dancing too, and Kansas Citians danced the last dance there on June 14, 1957. Even today, nothing quite compares to the romantic days of the Playmore.
It was a lot of fun.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
He was born into slavery on a plantation in Mexico, Missouri, and despite the oppression of the times, managed to develop an extraordinary gift. He had a way with horses, and that way would eventually get the attention of presidents, royalty, and the Kansas City elite. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Today, the story of a man who quite possibly knew the mind of a horse better than anyone on earth, Tom Bass.
In pre-industrialized Kansas City, our community, along with every other community, relied on horses. They were the car, the truck, and the tractor, a vital part of everyday life.
People who could train horses to be mannerable in the streets, on the bridle paths, wouldn't kill the kids, run off with the family, run into other horses on the streets. They were valuable people.
Tom Bass was arguably the best.
You want a good horse? You got a Bass horse. A Bass-trained horse was a prized horse. It was like owning a Ferrari.
Tom Bass was lured to Kansas City by businessmen eager to compete with horse trainers in St. Louis and in Kentucky. Soon, Tom was consulting everyone from Kansas City's wealthiest horse owners to the fire chief. And it was with the fire department that one of Tom's ideas led to what later developed into the American Royal.
The story goes is that they wanted to go to Europe to look at some horses in France and in England to pull these fire pumps. And Tom Bass came up with the idea that in order to fund that trip, maybe they might have a horse show.
Tom Bass would eventually move back to Mexico, Missouri, and his own stables. Success would bring hundreds of ribbons and trophies in horse shows against names like Vanderbilt and Bush. Presidents would visit his stables. He was invited to England by the Queen, but refused to cross the ocean, saying he never wanted to lose sight of a tree. Throughout his life, he never lost his compassion for his animals. He designed a more humane bit that is still used today.
He never patented a Bass bit because he said he did it for the horses of the world to make their life a little bit easier. Tom, I think, felt some kindred spirit with horses, and it very possibly could have been because he was born a slave, and slaves were treated like stock. And I think he felt some compassion for them. And there are lots of stories where he said he laid awake at night dreaming about how to make their life easier. A writer asked him, well, aren't you afraid of the automobile? The automobile is really coming on. He says, no, actually I'm glad, he said, because the automobile will free the horse up from his burdens that man has put on him, because a lot of horses will now have a better life and won't have to toil under the whip or somebody who's trying to make them do something they're physically not capable of doing.
Back when Kansas was part of a vast Indian territory, the Reverend Thomas Johnson was sent by the Methodist Church to start a mission. The year was 1839. He made such an impact that Johnson County bears his name. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Here at Reverend Johnson's Shawnee Indian Mission, these stately brick buildings reflect the legacy he left hundreds of children who passed through the prairie and learned a trade along the way.
From the beginning, the Shawnee Indian Mission was different from others of its time. In addition to religious lessons, the children learned the skills and trades of the day.
This site, you wonder when religion was actually taught, because the children were up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They had 6 hours of academic studies a day. They had 5 hours of learning or practicing a skill or trade. They had chores to perform because this was a 2,000-acre farm. Religion was actually only taught at the morning meal, the evening meal, and Sunday morning in the chapel. The children were in bed by 8:30 at night. They had free time from 8 to 8:30, and then it was candles out.
Children boarded at the school, sometimes for several years. One of the students, Sally Bluejacket, attended for 8 years.
The children had an awful busy schedule here. The girls were limited to the domestic arts, as you might believe. You learned how to spin yarn, dye it different colors using natural ingredients, weave it into cloth, cut and sew garments, because they made all the garments for everybody here. But cutting and sewing garments back in those days, it is a very, very time-consuming task because they didn't have the sewing machine. Everything was done by hand and needle and thread.
Boys, on the other hand, pursued opportunities in farming, carpentry, shoemaking, and blacksmithing.
As far as we can tell, blacksmithing among the boys was one of the more popular trades that they sought to learn about. And it's understandable because it's got a lot more activity to it, and you create things, and it's noisy, the sparks fly. They made hinges, they made latches, they made cooking utensils, anything and everything, because the people here were good tradesmen who taught them their skills and trades.
Though successful in its time, the mission closed in 1862 because political forces in Washington had once again displaced the Indians. They were forced to move from Kansas to the southern part of the Indian Territory, to what is now Oklahoma. Today, this historic site is a testament to the enduring spirit of countless Indian children. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. In 1904, a young man by the name of Isaac Katz and his new wife, Minnie, stepped off the train at Kansas City's Union Depot. Ike was convinced that Kansas City was the land of opportunity. He had $200 in his pocket and was ready to cash in on his dream of opening his own business.
When my grandfather Ike arrived in Kansas City, he decided an appropriate place to set up shop was right across from the train in the old Union Station on Union Avenue in the West Bottoms. He started out selling fruit, groceries, cigars, cigarettes, and newspapers. Business thrived.
So much so that Ike sent for 2 of his cousins and his brother, Michael, to share in the prosperity.
And they came down and assisted him, and business grew and grew until the outbreak of World War I in 1914.
Ike Katz was facing his first major crossroads. The war effort was hitting his business hard. He needed a reason to justify keeping his store open longer hours. The simple solution to this problem would change Ike Katz's life from that point on.
He hired a pharmacist for $22 a week, and that really was the beginning of the Katz Drug Company. They incorporated in 1914 and immediately opened stores at 8th and Grand and 12th and Walnut.
Katz was an aggressive competitor, constantly coming up with new ways to promote his business.
And perhaps the one that they're most known for, Katz Pays the Tax. And there was a revenue tax on many, many goods sold in the stores. And so they reduced the price of each of the goods by the amount of that tax, giving them a competitive edge over all their competitors.
Low prices and personal service served Ike Katz well through the war years, the 20s, the Great Depression, and beyond.
Ike considered his customers as his friends. He knew many by name. He had his suit coat fashioned with large pockets on the sides and filled them with little nips of perfume and chiclet gum and lifesaver candies. And as he would stroll down 12th Street to his office, he would hand these out to people. He was like the Pied Piper.
Katz Drug Company would expand throughout the Midwest until Ike Katz would arrive at another crossroads called self-service. And rather than change the company's personal service philosophy, the company was sold. Ike and his brother Michael gave back to the community through many charities, and today the UMKC School of Pharmacy bears the Katz brothers' names. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
They were called orphan train riders, homeless children from the East Coast who came to the Midwest in search of a home and parents who would love them. One of the orphan train riders became mayor of Kansas City. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Henry Jost was one of an estimated 200,000 children who made that difficult journey in what became the largest migration of children in our country's history.
The plight of homeless children was most evident in New York City, a major port of entry for immigrant families.
When the immigrants arrived, most of them were penniless. It wasn't, for the most part, well-to-do people who came to this country. Often they had huge families. It wasn't at all unusual for them to have maybe 10 children, 15 children. They found themselves living in hovels and just trying to patch it together. It's no surprise that a lot of those kids were turned out on the streets. The homeless children truly slept on heating grates, and there are photos to prove that, and existed by stealing bread and picking pockets and begging.
A man named Charles Loring Brace wanted to change the plight of these homeless children, and in 1853 he founded the Children's Aid Society. His vision was to take children out of the city by train to some place where there were families.
When Charles Loring Brace sent these children to the Midwest, he was sending them places not only where the trains ran, but where lots of hands were needed to do the labor, and farm families were more apt to make room at their table for an extra child. Some of these children were moved a number of times before they found homes that worked out for them. Sometimes the homes they found weren't good. Sometimes they truly were taken just to be field hands or household servants. Again, it's just an estimate, but the estimate is that probably about 50% of the children really found good homes, that they were wanted and loved.
One train rider fortunate to find a good home was Henry Jost, who at age 6 left the streets of New York City and journeyed to the farm of Judge Philip Dale in Nottoway County, Missouri.
It's a picture of him when he was 5 or 6, and you could see the gentle tenderness in the countenance and in the eyes. You just knew that whatever happened, he would take care of it.
With encouragement from Judge Dale, Henry put himself through law school and served as Kansas City's mayor from 1912 to 1916. After serving one term in Congress, he declined re-election.
And they used to say that the reason he didn't stay in Washington is because he was too honest.
According to some accounts, nearly 500 orphan train riders are still living, with amazing stories to tell about their courageous journey to find home. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
The turn of the century. Just the words set the mind to wondering about what the next millennium may hold. Hello, I'm Bill Callaherca for Kansas City Crossroads. Today, as we ponder what the year 2000 will bring, we want to take you back to the last turn of the century and a story of a group of pioneering women who were determined to make the 1900s better than the 1800s. Their impact on our community has been legendary and will take us well into the next century.
In the late 1800s, Kansas City women began to create small clubs to read and study. As the phenomenon grew, so did the size of the groups. In particular, a club named Kansas City Athenaeum.
It would be a time to study together and work together to fit into a new world. Very different in the 1900s than it had been in the 1800s. They were expecting great things to happen, looking forward to the time when women could own property and could vote and could think for themselves and to be able to finance.
The Athenaeum was the brainchild of 7 women, led by Mary Harmon Weeks. The mission was to better the community in 7 different categories: art, education, home, literature, music, philosophy and science, and social ethics. The membership numbers grew rapidly, and their efforts for women and children's issues had lasting effects.
Mary Harmon Weeks was the first president of the Kansas City Athenaeum. She is really the parent and the starter of the Parent-Teacher Association. She was so anxious that children go to school and that they love school. She wanted the kindergarten to be a part of the school system. And through her efforts, we have kindergartens today.
By the 1920s, Kansas City Athenaeum was 1,000 members strong and powerful enough to take on City Hall for the good of their causes.
Phoebe Jane S. was a crusader. When I think about Miss S., I think about her with this little black notebook, always writing down things that had to be done. As she would go to one courtroom and another, always fighting for women and always for children.
In Kansas City Athenaeum's now more than 100-year-old history, members have fought and conquered literally dozens of issues on behalf of all the women and children of Kansas City.
But most of all, it changed the lives of women to service and to education.
Their accomplishments have stood the test of time and could easily serve as a model for the next 100 years. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherca.
A crisp night in late October. The scent of a crackling fire. You're surrounded by woods, and who knows what else. The perfect time for a story. Hello, I'm Bill Callaherca for Kansas City Crossroads. Missouri and Kansas are rich with folk tales that grow richer in each telling. And as Halloween approaches, we wanted to share one of those folk tales with you. The story begins just a little southwest of here, across Honey Creek, near the town of Columbus in Johnson County, Missouri, where, according to local legend, the appearance of a mysterious bright light here in the woods changed the Missouri farm family forever.
One of the earliest families to settle near Columbus was the Davidson family. Jonas Davidson worked the land, along with his family and his slaves. It was nearing the end of the harvest season, the end of another hard day, when they first noticed something strange in the northern sky. A light, too big for a star, too small for the moon. It didn't move, but it was hard to take your eye off it.
It's nothing.
What was it? That was the topic of conversation well into the evening. The next evening, around dusk, the bright light was back, except now it was bigger. It appeared closer, as if it was planning on dropping out of the sky into Jonas Davidson's fields. The next night, even larger, and every night thereafter the mysterious light grew and grew over the Davidson farm until it was too large to ignore. Jonas was at a crossroads. He had been silent since the light first appeared. but now the light seemed to be threatening the safety of his family and his slaves.
It's scaring my family.
He knew he had to do something. The light was now so big and bright and so low in the sky, he felt he could walk to the end of his property and touch it. So he set out to do just that. You could see Jonas's silhouette shrinking smaller and smaller into the light until he was engulfed by it. The sound of Jonas's boots shuffling through the fallen leaves was all that hinted that he was still there. And then the sound stopped. And in the space of a moment, the light went out. An eerie darkness fell over the Davidson farm. The anxiety caused by the once bright light was replaced with anxiety caused by the absence of Jonas Davidson.
Ma'am, he's here.
Suddenly, he appears at the front door, ashen, speechless. He walks right by his family, ignoring the obvious questions about what happened, and goes to bed.
This is your Declaration of Freedom.
The next morning, Mr. Davidson called all of his slaves together and presented each with a letter granting them their freedom. To this day, no one knows what Jonas Davidson experienced when he confronted the light here in the woods in Johnson County.
And the light never reappeared after he freed his slaves. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka. In our modern electoral times of computerized polling and massive media campaigns, it would sometimes appear that an election is all but over before the first vote is cast. But polls don't decide elections. People do. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads on a campaign trail in 1948, where it came down to the polls versus the people. The people won, and many were actually surprised.
He said polls don't mean a thing. He said you tell them the truth about everything and they'll believe you and they'll vote for you. He said if Moses had taken a poll, he never would have gone out of Israel.
Harry Truman worked hard in the campaign of 1948. Over the course of 5 months, it was estimated that he traveled more than 31,000 miles and gave 356 speeches to between 12 and 15 million people.
He was in his 60s then, and he had lots of stamina. Someone with less stamina couldn't have done that. But he was enthusiastic, he believed in what he was doing, and he did it. The newsmen who followed him had their tongues hanging out. Sometimes he'd make 4 and 5 speeches a day in different stops. Not all the big cities, they stopped in a lot of little places.
It was exciting, and you know, really, nobody thought he had a chance. But he fooled them on the whistle stop. He was just one-on-one, really, and the people across the country just really did believe him, and they should have. He was appealing to the common person, to the ordinary American, but it was the great minds that thought that he had lost considerably. But the little towns were all for him.
On election night, Mr. Truman was at the Elms Hotel in Excelsior Springs. He had enjoyed a Turkish bath, eaten a ham sandwich with a glass of milk, and gone to bed. He was awakened at 4 a.m. by Secret Service agents who told him he was winning. By 6 a.m., he was at the Muehleback Hotel with campaign staff in full celebratory spirit. Dewey conceded at 10:14 a.m. Kansas City time on the morning of November 3, 1948. When word reached independence, the city exploded in celebration, honking horns, ringing bells, blowing whistles, and sounding every siren. Pandemonium reigned.
On the south side of the square, he stood on the steps. They blocked off the street in front of the courthouse from one street to the other. And the crowd absolutely couldn't move. There were that many people. Everybody was so proud. Politics sort of melted away.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka.
Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. The man who once lived behind me was one of 3 architects of one of the most daring business ventures in American history. His name was Alexander Majors. He and his two partners, W.H. Russell and William Waddell, created the Pony Express. It was a dangerous and very unprofitable business proposition, and they knew that going in, but they did it anyway, and proved that the American spirit would not be broken by the treacherous path to the West.
Through 1859, settlers were inching their way toward California with their hopes and dreams packed on the backs of mules and ox teams and in stagecoaches. Once they reached California, everything accelerated with the gold rush. And with that acceleration came a need for faster communication east to west.
And Russell, Majors, and Waddell, the founders of the Pony Express, realize this need, and they want to take advantage of that. They meet with the senator from California, and their real hope is to get a federal contract to carry the mail for $1 million.
But first, the three businessmen had to prove that it could be done. So they set up relay stations over almost 2,000 miles of the untamed West.
The relay stations were set up every 10 to 15 miles. Then there was a bigger station called a home station every 75 to 80 miles. The relay stations were the points where the riders changed horses. And legend has it they had 2 minutes to change at each of these. They could switch their mochila that they carried the mail in. They could get something to eat, maybe go to the bathroom, and then they had to be on the route again. The home stations were where they changed riders, and they were much bigger. A lot of times these would be somebody's ranch or stagecoach stops. Hotels would grow up around them. A lot of times towns would grow up around them. Well, the cost for mailing a letter back in 1860 was $5 per half ounce. Today's cost, that's about $85. So these really aren't letters, Dear Mom, how are things back home? They're really kind of the business, the Federal Express of 1860.
Physically and mentally demanding, the Pony Express rider was a special breed.
Legend has it that they were young, wiry, skinny fellows, orphans preferred because of the dangerous work. The reality is there were a lot of young riders, but there were just as many that were in their 20s and 30s as well.
Raise your right hand.
The firm, they were very religious folks, and they made the riders swear an oath. They gave all of them a Bible, and they made them swear an oath, basically that they would not drink, swear, or fight while they were in the employee of Russell, Majors, and Waddell.
The Pony Express rides longer in our memories than it did across the western terrain, only lasting between 18 and 19 months. Russell, Majors, and Waddell never got that $1 million government contract, and eventually the telegraph and the Transcontinental Railroad made the Pony Express obsolete. But the legends it created remain in full gallop. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka.
During the holiday season of 1925, Charles Petro walked the streets of the plaza and came up with a bright idea. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. With the flip of a switch, Mr. Petro gave birth to a glow that has illuminated the spirits of holiday shoppers for decades in this historic district.
Well, the first Christmas lights with a 16-bulb stringer over a doorway in a building that we called Mill Creek. All the buildings were on the north side of 47th Street at that time.
In the years that followed, Mr. Petro added more lights, some bells and candles, and watched a bright idea grow into a spectacular holiday tradition. Mr. Petro also added a crew to install the lights.
The way those old boys did it, they must have been made out of iron. It was all done with wooden ladders. Climb up that ladder, button on 2 nails or whatever a man can reach off the ladder. That's, maybe 5 or 6 feet, left to right, tops. Come back down, move the ladder over, go back up. Physically, it was extremely difficult. It's difficult enough now, but it was a lot worse then.
While some things have improved conditions for the crew over the years, there's still that element of risk. Ivan has dealt with that every year since 1967.
At the end of the first season of that, I thought, I'll never, never do these lights again. I thought it was kind of harrowing. You dream about falling off of things at night. You wake up just before you hit the pavement. So anyway, that was kind of bad on me. I don't like heights all that well. I respect them a lot.
When all the towers and balconies and parapet walls are trimmed with 75 miles of wire and 200,000 bulbs, it's time to run a test in the pre-dawn hours while the city sleeps.
We have it wired together where it's all one unit, so the ceremony switch does function. We're on site, so in the event of a malfunction, we can get it up and going. But the chances of a mechanical failure are extremely small, but there is the chance.
That chance keeps the anxiety high in the moments before the big ceremony Thanksgiving Day. With 250,000 people watching, the countdown begins. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In an instant, the plaza glows with lights and smiles throughout the holiday season.
You know, that's part of the rewards of doing the task. If you can see pleasure or happiness in someone's face, whether it be someone who's 9 or 90 or 3, it's nice to be able to be a part of that.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Today we know this place as the Crossroads between 435 and State Line. In 1843, State Line marked the edge of the United States. As hundreds of pioneers in covered wagons passed into the Kansas Territory on their way to California, Oregon, or Santa Fe, one of their last stops was here at Watts Mill.
The purpose of the mill, as a grist mill, they would take grain and grind it into flour. Now, the mill was visited by local farmers, for one thing, but also some of the people that came out to begin the westward migration. It was a very good assembly point. In addition to having fresh water on Indian Creek, in addition to having wood and grazing area, it was away from the overcrowded areas of Westport Landing, which is now, of course, is River Market, or Independence. These are where the initial major beginning points of the trails. Now, it was a water-driven mill, so the amount of flour they could process was fairly limited. They would maybe 4 to 5 bushels an hour. And if you had 100 wagons with all of these families, many of them wanting their grain processed, it would take quite a few days, if not a few weeks.
The Watts family purchased the mill in 1852, and it wasn't long before the talents of Stubbins Watts were as legendary as his long white beard.
Quite often, after Stubbins started playing fiddle, they danced all night, and if the party were a good party, Stubbins would say that they danced the following day too before they took off. So I think it was a great place psychologically for the pioneers to get started.
So with the conclusion of the Civil War, the economics in this area changed fairly dramatically. And while Kansas City had become a center of milling, that particular site, because of the size of the mill, it couldn't compete with larger mills. It was really a fairly small operation, and it really fell into somewhat disrepair, and of course was never a significant site of milling after that period.
By 1939, operations at the mill ceased for good. The mill continued to deteriorate and was finally demolished in 1949.
When you go there and you read the history and you look about you and try to ignore the shopping center and ignore the car dealer, but look at the river and think of those people assembled there and think of what lay in wait for them. The river hasn't changed much, the falls are still there. It's not hard to get caught up in what occurred there, such a significant part of our history in May of 1843. We're very lucky to have Watts Mill here.
At this time of year, we often see children's eyes light up with wonder as they ponder the timeless question, where do all these toys come from? When we grow older, of course, we find out the truth. Santa didn't make them all. Santa's elves did.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Many of the treasures those elves have made through the years have found their way to Kansas City. here at the Toy and Miniature Museum.
When the early settlers came to America, they packed some toys. And soon they were making their own, sitting down with a knife and carving out a whistle or sewing garments for nuthead dolls. By 1840, many towns in America had a toy store.
Very first toys were figures of dolls or in the shape of a doll, but marbles were found way back in Egyptian tombs. And even today, you still can pick up ones made out of stone that the slaves made for their children. I have a particular fondness for things that parents made for their children. They didn't necessarily weren't gifted or skillful, but they always show lots of love.
Wise parents soon discovered play was children's work, and they appreciated that play could be very instructional.
I think the most fun of all are the toy houses, because they reflect reality, but they leave lots of room for imagination. And then you get to furnish them, and then you get to put the people in. On and on. You can play by the hour in a dollhouse. Up until now, boys really didn't have dolls' houses, nor did they have dolls. Now they do have dolls today, but they're called action figures. And their dolls' houses are castles. So again, you get the aggressive mode or protective mode of the male child.
Those continuing the tradition of Santa's elves still are carving out toys the old-fashioned way.
There's no other feeling like it when you can give somebody something that you've made that you know that they'll share. You're not only just thinking of the toys that you're making or what could I make for the children, but you're thinking of the children themselves and how good it will do them. Toys are for boys and girls, and when you got toys, you play. And when you play, you're happy. And that's what it's all about. I like making toys to make people happy.
At the Toy and Miniature Museum of Kansas City, the treasures of more than a century of toy makers fill a child's eyes with wonder.
It's a happy place, and people love to come to it, and not just children. Adults seem to enjoy it just as much as children. And it's a very enlightening sort of idea for children because they see what other children have played with at other times. And then, of course, the parents are always saying, you know, I had that. I wonder what happened to it.
Hello, I'm Bill Callaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. Every family celebrates the holidays with favorite traditions they enjoy year after year. Usually one of those traditions is a visit to Santa. But from 1935 to 1970, children in Kansas City enjoyed a holiday tradition no other city had, a visit to the fairy princess.
Every Christmas, my brother and I would go downtown, and the one place we wanted to go was Klein's department store at 11th and Main, and we'd get on that elevator and we'd ride up to Toyland. And in Toyland, they had all these wonderful toys, but the best part was they had the fairy princess. And we thought she was the best thing ever, because not only was she beautiful, she was magical.
The fairy princess listened to children's wishes, and then she waved her magic wand.
She'd wave that, and presto, out would come a beautifully wrapped gift. So you would then unwrap the gift, and you would have a Christmas gift even before Christmas in your hand to enjoy right then and there. You didn't have to wait till Christmas morning. We loved it. It was the highlight of our downtown Christmas experience.
The Christmas magic downtown included a winter wonderland at the Jones store.
And they had a train that my brother and I also loved to go to right after we went to the Fairy Princess, because you could ride in this train and you just didn't go round and round. They had an actual winter wonderland that had been created. It was quite wonderful.
The lure of winter wonderlands and animated store windows attracted crowds downtown until families started moving to the suburbs.
Klein's department store closed in 1970. Many of the department stores closed, and so you lost all of that wonderful magic that was even beyond the Fairy Princess, because it was a magical time downtown.
How old did you say you were? 5.
To recreate one of the treasured traditions of downtown Christmas, the Kansas City Museum brought back the Fairy Princess, who, with the wave of her magic wand, continues to make children's wishes come true.
That's a part of our history that was, I felt, something the children of today should be able to enjoy, as I and my brother did. And now I'm bringing my great nieces and nephews and my grandchildren here. And you know what? They love her as much as I did.
We often take for granted the convenience of having ice at our fingertips. However, in our not too distant past, in the late 1940s and early 50s, a refrigerator was a newfangled invention. Before that is a memory frozen in time. Hello, I'm Bill Callaherca for Kansas City Crossroads. Today, the age of the icebox in Kansas City. A day when the cold was brought to your door, not by the weatherman, but by the Iceman.
I can remember the Iceman dressed in regular working clothes, but he also had an apron in front and an apron in back that hung from his shoulders. It was leather, so that he wouldn't get soaked with the melting ice. And he would drip water all over the stairway and in the kitchen. And many women who were very, very particular would lay down newspapers on the floor.
Ice was a hot commodity in the early 1900s in Kansas City.
Well, at one time, the ice business was a third-ranking business in the United States. Kansas City Ice Company had 21 plants. At one time, there was probably over 40 plants here in Kansas City. This plant right here produced over 250 ton a day, year-round.
Railroads were a big user for their refrigerated cars, restaurants too. And then there was the home delivery.
The Iceman came maybe every other day or so, and for him to know how much ice to bring, we left a card in the window. And it said either 10, 25, 50, or 100. The number that was up, that was the number that he had to bring up to third floor. And the ice would go in the ice box.
The City Ice Company boasted the largest and oldest fleet of Chevrolet delivery trucks in the world. It was hard not to spot one traveling the streets of Kansas City. Ice was a very solid business.
At one time, this place had 6 full-time telephone operators. On the north side of the building was the storage building that held approximately 30,300-pound cakes. It held 1,500 cakes to a tier, 20 tiers high. They had a single cake elevator in there that took the ice up and down.
But as time passed, the ice business began to slide with the advent of the refrigerator. And much to the dismay of the Iceman, Kansas Citians warmed up to the idea fairly quickly, leaving behind the notion of how precious ice had been.
I can remember picnics we had, 4th of July picnics we'd have on the church lawn, and we would have about a 40-gallon stoneware jar, and they would get a hunk of ice, maybe weighed 10 pounds, and put in there and have iced tea in it, to serve. And we thought it was such a treat, to have real iced tea.
In the holiday season of 1882, Frank James of the notorious James Gang was in jail. And strange as it may seem, he was thankful to be there. Although he had successfully eluded the law since the Civil War, he was tired of running. A $10,000 bounty had been placed on him and his brother Jesse, and Jesse had just been shot and killed by one of his own men. Frank feared that he was next, so this uncatchable, legendary criminal surrendered. Hello, I'm Bill Callaherca. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, the brief and bizarre holiday detention of Frank James in the Independence Jail. By the time Frank James surrendered in October 1882, he had become somewhat of a folk hero.
He surrendered in Jefferson City to Governor Crittenden and to the surprise of all Missourians practically. He was believed to be uncatchable. He was brought from Jefferson City, Missouri to Independence here, where charges were pending against him.
For a man headed for jail, Frank James received a warm reception.
Frank, what an honor. Boys, got a genuine hero in here. You all take care of him.
And in that reception, there were lots of the local business leaders, including bankers, which is kind of an ironic twist when a banker comes and visits Frank James on his arrival to Independence.
This area was home to many Confederate sympathizers, and Frank was seen as a man who spent most of life fighting back the northern influences represented by banks and railroads. Frank James was a guest of the citizens of Jackson County from October 1882 to January 1883.
I brought you some flowers, Mr. James.
If you look at the jail cells here at the old jail, you'll see that most folks didn't have very good accommodations. There might be a mat on the floor, maybe a chair, and that would be about it. Frank James did have a dresser. He had a rocking chair so that he could relax.
Frank, your family is here.
And his wife and child were allowed to be here with him at almost all times, which in itself is a difference between the other prisoners.
By the time Frank James went to trial in Gallatin, Missouri, the case had grabbed the attention of the entire nation.
And after 16 days of trial, which was unheard of at that time, after having dream teams on both sides, 6 defense and 6 prosecution attorneys who were as good as you could get, Frank James was found not guilty.
Frank James lived out a relatively normal life, selling shoes and appearing in Wild West shows with Cole Younger. He died where he was born, here in Kearney, Missouri, on February 18, 1915. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherka. Long, long ago, on the night of the very first Christmas, all of creation welcomed the Christ child with special gifts. Everything had something to offer the child, including the trees. The fruit trees all produced tasty treats. The sycamore offered comforting shade, and the stately oak gave beautiful wood. But the humble fir tree felt sad because it didn't have any gifts worthy to give the newborn child. It had no rich-grained wood, it produced no tasty fruit, and it didn't even have a wonderful smell like the cedar. Up in the heavens, the stars gazed down on the humble fir tree, and their hearts ached because it was so sad. So the stars got together and decided to reach down from the heavens and touch the tree with their brilliant light. The light of the stars made the fir tree glow with such radiance that the Heavenly Father saw the tree and thought it was the most beautiful gift of all. So he blessed the tree with a special gift of its own. Each fall, when all the other trees lost their leaves, the fir tree remained forever green. And each holiday season we decorate our trees with lights as a reminder of the gift from the stars to the humble fir tree on the night Christ was born. The Christmas tree has illuminated the spirits of Kansas Citians for generations. Back in 1908, Mayor Tom Crittenden initiated the Mayor's Christmas Tree, asking citizens to place gifts under the tree for those neighbors less fortunate. The tree became a symbol of our city's generous spirit, growing each year both in its size and in the generosity it sparked. Today, the mayor's Christmas tree, a Douglas fir, towers 100 feet over Crown Center Square. It's almost as big as the hearts of Kansas Citians. I'm Bill Callaherka. From all of us at Kansas City Crossroads, happy holidays. When this theater first opened in 1900, the audience arrived by horse-drawn carriage, perhaps to watch vaudeville star Fanny Brice. Hello, I'm Bill Callaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. Through the years, the Folly Stage has hosted such legendary performers as the Marx Brothers and Gypsy Rose Lee. It has seen its share of vaudeville and burlesque, and in the 1970s, it nearly became a parking lot. But thanks to some visionary Kansas Citians, it has been restored to its original grandeur, so that now people can arrive by limousine to what some may call Kansas City's Carnegie Hall.
It's seen a colorful history over the years. I've often said that there's not another stage anywhere in the world that has a broader range of entertainment than the Folly. Before there were motion pictures, vaudeville was a huge touring production structure in the United States, and virtually every city and even small towns had a vaudeville theater. And there were literally thousands of vaudeville entertainers that toured America.
At one time or another, all the national headliners took a bow on the Folly Stage.
And it included all kinds of attractions. There were the baggy pants comedians, there were jugglers, there were theatrical sketches, and then there was always the burlesque, the showgirls that would come out. The heyday of the burlesque era was during the 1940s. Of course, that was during the World War II era, and thousands of servicemen passed through Kansas City, stopping off from Union Station, and this was one of the primary tourist spots for servicemen to visit. One of the famous strippers or burlesque stars was Sally Rand, and she became famous for her fan dancing, where she would stand behind these huge feathered fans and suggestively move them around. I don't know that all that much was revealed, but I think it was more the art of suggestion than anything else.
During the 1950s, the Folly began its demise. After showing X-rated movies in the 1960s, the Folly's tattered curtain closed for the last time.
There were window panes broken on the outside that remained broken for literally decades. I know this because when they went in to clean out the attic space, they had to clean out 9 tons of pigeon droppings from the attic of the Folly. So you can only imagine how long it would have taken for that to have built up.
Through a community-wide effort, Kansas City's grand old theater was saved from the wrecking ball. Restoration paid close attention to detail, including the lighted ball that was part of the 1900 design.
In 1981, when the Folly reopened, they did start the tradition that lasted for at least a few years, where people would gather in Barney Alice Plaza and the ball would drop to ring in the new year here in Kansas City.
Today, the Folly Stage once again plays host to nationally acclaimed performers.
The world-renowned acoustics are of world-class variety, and the very same performers that appear at Carnegie Hall also appear on the stage of the Folly Theater. So it's really not a stretch to refer to it as Kansas City's Carnegie Hall.
Just a few miles northeast of downtown Kansas City, an underground giant has bored itself into the side of Bethany Falls Ledge along the Missouri River. Its name is Subtropolis.
Hello, I'm Bill Callaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. For more than 50 years, Kansas Citians have picked away at this hard limestone and carved out the world's, that's right, the world's largest underground industrial park. The original reels of Gone with the Wind are stored here, as are the original MASH episodes, and there's room for plenty more. You could fit 35 Arrowhead stadiums in this place. But this subterraneous wonder as it exists today was really an afterthought. The original miners of Bethany Falls were more interested in what they could take out than what they put in.
The beginning stages of underground real estate development started in the early 1930s. There was an asphalt paving company called Midwest Precode. They needed crushed stone for their mining operation to create asphalt. There was a resource along the Missouri riverbeds. The Bethany Falls limestone, ledge of limestone, was a very hard limestone, which was good for the crushed stone that they needed. We began laterally mining into the side of the limestone bluff in 1945. When the initial mining started, they had no concept of using the space for secondary usage in later years.
It wasn't until 1964 that the underground storage idea began to emerge. Miners changed from a random method of mining to a room and pillar method, creating a future that was wide open.
It's amazing to imagine that from a limestone crushing operation, the facility has grown to approximately 10 million square feet of developed space, with 4.5 million square feet of space available for leasing.
Every day is a near perfect day underground. Subtropolis naturally stays between 65 and 72 degrees, ideal for storage.
If you are a stamp collector, then your stamps would be distributed from this facility. They have approximately 300,000 square feet where they store collector stamps and distribute them. We also have a wide assortment of food products. Again, because of the temperature and humidity control, it makes it ideal for storage of candy, frozen products, dried canned goods.
45 companies make Subtropolis their home, and approximately 1,300 people drive into the underground every day to work. Little did the first miners of limestone here realize that they were paving the way to such a prosperous future under the surface of Bethany Falls. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Walking through these doors is like walking back in time to an era when craftsmen lovingly created these jewels of living light. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Here in the River Market, we find a story about a remarkable lady who is sometimes called Kansas City's Queen of Stained Glass.
It all started innocently enough when the Meyerhoffs were looking for ways to decorate their authentic German restaurants.
We knew we needed stained glass, and we found that there was lots of stained glass in and around Kansas City.
They often found the stained glass in buildings destined for the wrecking ball, so Mrs. Meyerhoff set out on a rescue mission.
We want to rescue all that we can because they are treasures, and you can never find them elsewhere because they came from the finest old churches and the most beautiful homes in this part of the country.
Even though she is no longer in the restaurant business, Mrs. Meyerhoff has transformed her passion for rescuing stained glass into what is perhaps the largest collection in the country.
As you see, there's very little room to even put more things, so I have another warehouse because I have so many that I'm rescuing and treasuring. They're just like my children.
When Mrs. Meyerhoff adopted her children, she often found them covered with years of dirt and dust, so she set about learning the art of stained glass restoration.
We have learned by finding very old artists that worked on them 50 or 60 years ago.
What Mrs. Meyerhoff learned, she passed on to her daughter, and she passed on what she had learned to her husband. Sometimes finding just the right piece of glass takes some time.
We have hundreds of old windows
And so we take and save every piece of glass that we have, and then it's just a process of going through with a light box and a various glass until you come to something that is the same or that is close as possible.
When the restoration work is complete, the windows are ready to catch the light as the sun moves across the sky from dawn toward dusk.
They have many different facets of the glass, and it's different times of the day. They are really treasures because there's nothing else that gives the wonderful rays and tells a story. It tells the story of its time.
Harry Truman called him, quote, the best damn painter in America. Thomas Hart Benton and his expansive murals taught us something about ourselves. Hello, I'm Bill Callagher for Kansas City Crossroads. His style was distinctly Benton, straightforward, colorful, and sometimes brutally honest.
For much of his life, Thomas Hart Benton called Kansas City home.
He was an American scene painter, and at that time in the 1930s, middle 30s, the scene painters, the realistic painters were not in vogue. This new abstractionism had arisen, and Benton was at war with those people. And so he finally decided to give up New York, and that's why they moved here and came back here.
His studio in the Valentine neighborhood welcomed friends who shared an appreciation of his unpretentious manner and his salty wit.
Looked very much like it does today. They didn't disturb it much. It was smelled of turpentine and his paints. You can see all these brushes are still here.
Using those brushes to paint America the way he saw it, Benton achieved worldwide acclaim.
Because fame came to him early and late, and he wore it simply as a plain and sometimes prickly garment, sometimes bourbon-stained, but never starchy. The greatest thing I think that ever happened to him was his wife. He married a native-born Italian, Rita Piacenza. She husbanded the fires of his genius in his life and took care of him. I don't think he would have amounted to become a great painter if it hadn't been for her.
In addition to his skills as a painter, Benton played a mean harmonica.
He was an amazing harmonica player. He, in fact, invented a method of scaling harmonica music on the 4 or 5 lines, and then he had these little symbols which represented inhaling or exhaling. And there were notes of a scale, and it's known as Benton's harmonica music.
Benton is probably best remembered for capturing the heart of America and his native Missouri.
He disdained without malice high society, which he likened to, quote, froth on a glass of beer, close quote. But he deeply loved what he called the solid underneath layer of common folk and his fellow man. And through his remarkable, multifaceted genius, he portrayed for all of us these wondrous images on canvas, on paper, on stone, and in figures of clay and bronze. That was Thomas Hart Benton.
If you were to name the great architects of Kansas City's prosperity, you would have to include Robert Alexander Long. After all, he provided the framework for almost every warehouse, factory, and home built in Kansas City in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Mr. Long was a lumber baron who built this mansion as a symbol of his and Kansas City's early success. Hello, I'm Bill Callagher for Kansas City Crossroads. Today it stands as a monument to history, thanks to a lady by the name of Olive Hoggins, who used a flashlight to see the mansion through the dark days of the Great Depression.
R.A. Long had enjoyed 3 long decades of prosperity, but when the Great Depression hit in 1929, Long struggled to keep his business out of receivership.
Their lumber company was, I would say, in a great decline, and therefore they were very upset because they couldn't keep the house. It cost a fortune to heat this house.
The house had 15 bathrooms and about 50 rooms, including a bowling alley in the basement. After Mr. Long died in 1934, the mansion on Gladstone Boulevard found itself at its first crossroads, and in 1939, Long's daughters gave the house to Kansas City. To ensure the house did not fall into disrepair, Mrs. Olive Huggins kept vigil.
Olive Huggins came and lived here all by herself. The story is she lived here all alone with a flashlight so the city and nobody else would tear it down or vandalize it. She was protecting the property. And of course at that time nobody had any money to preserve the mansion. But she was persistent. So she had an idea. She thought, well, I'm going to get women of influence in the community, hopefully somebody that has the money and the influence that will save this building.
And she did. She enlisted the help of 4 influential women, Mrs. May Reed Porter, Mrs. Lorraine Page, Mrs. Bessie Jones, and Mrs. Wanda Graham. Together, they worked tirelessly to save the building.
So for 3 years, they just came out here and did it all on their own. They had stories of people in the neighborhood bringing them lunch because there was, of course, no place to eat. There was hardly any heat, and they didn't care. They really knew that it was important for Kansas City to have a history museum.
The Kansas City Museum proudly opened to the public in May 1940, featuring an extensive American Indian collection. And now, when the museum collections become part of Science City, the mansion on Gladstone Boulevard finds itself at another crossroads, with its next chapter yet to be written.
These women had a dream, and the Friends of Corinthian all have the same dream. We would like to bring it back in the original, the way it was.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Calaherka. Few names across the landscape of Kansas City history stir more raw emotion, both positive and negative, than the name Tom Pendergast. From 1910 to 1939, the name Pendergast was synonymous with power, influence, and corruption. Hello, I'm Bill Calaherka. Today we explore a crossroads in Kansas City history created by a single man and uncover the mystique of Pendergast prosperity and how the secret of his power was found in the color of the ink in his pen. In 1910, a 38-year-old Tom Pendergast was getting his first real taste of politics as a newly elected city council member. He was following the same career path as his older brother Jim, something he had been doing since he was 18 years old, first as a deputy constable and later a saloon owner on 12th Street. But Pendergast's term on the council was short-lived, by his own design, as most things were. He retired from elected office in 1915 to head the Jackson Democratic Club, where his power and influence really began to grow.
Tom Pendergast, beginning in 1928, on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, would meet the public who wished to talk with him at the headquarters of the Jackson Democratic Club. Basically, this was a granting of favors, or in some cases not. Frequently, the requests were for jobs. He would write a note to this person, and if he wrote it in red, that was a signal to everyone at the other end that Tom really would like you to grant this request. If he wrote it in blue, it meant don't grant this request. And if he wrote it in a black pencil, it was, well, you can do it, but it's no favor to me. The people coming in did not necessarily understand the system because they would get the same favorable kind of recommendation from Pendergast. Regardless, it just might be in a different color of pencil.
Pendergast, or Boss Tom as he became known, appeared to be running Kansas City from the second story of a small office at 1908 Main Street.
But the reality was, in those days, if you wanted something done in the city for yourself or an improvement to the city or whatever, you knew where to go, Tom Pendergast's office. He had a way of expressing his wishes as demands.
By the mid-1930s, Tom Pendergast was the controlling partner in more than 20 businesses, including liquor, concrete that built most of downtown, and a racetrack at which he bet $2 million on horses in 1935, losing $600,000.
It was an example both of power corrupting and of power being used effectively, because there were many ways in which the city accomplished things in the 1930s that other cities wished they could accomplish.
Tom Pendergast went to prison in 1939 for tax evasion, was out within a year, but died before the end of his 5-year probation on January 26, 1945. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
A remarkable Kansas City woman named Hazel Hedges Rollins had a flair for pulling strings. With her artistic talents and her passion for puppets, Hazel dedicated her life to children and the wonders of their imaginations. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. Hazel transformed this synagogue on Admiral Boulevard into the largest production facility in the world for the making of puppets and marionettes. Armed with a fine arts degree from KU in 1932, Hazel took a job as a switchboard operator at the Nelson Atkins Museum and began helping with the marionette classes there. At the same time, she started making marionettes, first for the Boy Next Door and then for the Brookside Toy Store and Emery Bird Thayer. After a visit to the New York Toy Fair in 1935, Hazel returned with orders from all over the country, and she knew she was in business.
It had been in the recreation room of their home, and her father was getting concerned that they were running a business out of a home, and he didn't want to do that, so he thought she ought to find a place to set this business up.
Over the years, Hazel set up business at various locations in Kansas City, finally settling on Admiral Boulevard. By this time, she was producing 1,000 puppets a week.
In fact, her first puppets were hand-carved wooden heads. But later they went to a lacquer. It was a sodium silicate wood paste combination, and then it was dipped in lacquer, which was very time-consuming. It took hours, days for it to dry.
Even though production processes improved over the years, the making of puppets and marionettes was always labor-intensive because much of it was done by hand.
So then after the war, when plastics came along, they were able to go to this tenite, they called it. It was an early type of plastic. And so, it made a more interesting looking puppet, more durable.
The popularity of Hazel's puppets and marionettes soared.
People had theaters in their home. This was kind of like the TV, only you had a theater, and children would perform things. As soon as television came along, they shifted the marionettes to television, and Howdy Doody was popular, and Sherry Lewis.
The purpose of puppets was always to spark children's imaginations.
I think she truly liked children, and I think she loved the marionettes.
Hazel and her husband Woody retired in 1975 and sold the business. During its peak, Hazel's produced up to 250,000 puppets and marionettes each year, and more than 300 different designs. But Tito the Clown was always the perennial favorite. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka. On this piece of land here at Barney Alice Plaza, a miracle was performed in 1900. Not by any cosmic force, but you could call it spiritual. Citizens at the time called it the spirit of Kansas City. Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka. Today on Kansas City Crossroads, an extraordinary display of determination by a young Kansas City that was dubbed the 90-Day Miracle.
In the late 1800s, Kansas City was thinking big. It was already one of 3 major cities in the Midwest and determined to take its place on the national map as a prominent center of trade. An important key to growing Kansas City was to create a gathering place.
I believe it was in 1893, William Rockwell Nelson started promoting
the need for having a convention center, which would allow the city to have large groups of people, large shows, and things that would benefit Kansas City and the whole area.
And the whole area got behind the effort. On December 2nd, 1897, with a $100,000 budget, Kansas City decided to build a convention center. 14 months and $225,000 later, Kansas City's convention center opened, and no one seemed to mind that it cost more than double the original budget. And plans were already in place for the center to host its first major event, the Democratic National Convention of 1900. But about 1 p.m. on April 4th, 1900, 3 months before Kansas City was to host the nation, the unthinkable happened. Kansas City's brand new convention center was on fire, and in no time, 6 years of dreaming, planning, and building was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. The city was devastated, but not down.
The whole city pulled together and got the railroads, all of the unions that were in existence at that time, the working unions, to construct this convention center, all made it a big priority to have this center finished because everyone felt it was so important for Kansas City and for the area at that time to have this very important event happen in Kansas City.
In 3 short months, with crews working around the clock, Kansas City rebuilt its convention center.
The slogan, Kansas City Spirit, arose from the efforts of everyone. All of the population of the city at that time were involved in having this wonderful convention center completed, and on July the 4th, 1900, indeed, the convention center was open.
Kansas City had pulled off a miracle in front of a national audience, solidifying Missouri's stature as the show-me state. William Jennings Bryan was chosen as the Democratic candidate at the convention, but lost the presidential election to William McKinley. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Kalahurka.
Hello, I'm Bill Kalahurka for Kansas City Crossroads. On July 11, 1879, Edward Harry Kelly was born with a song in his heart. He spent all of his 75 years in Kansas City, putting our town's life and times to music. He predated jazz, cutting his musical teeth on marches. But as he matured as a composer and performer, his music grew more offbeat. Ragtime, they called it. People loved it. Not just here in Kansas City, but around the world. The name E. Harry Kelly was inked in our nation's musical notation as one of the fathers of ragtime.
Music before ragtime was pretty much on the beat. Every note was on the beat. Dum 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 dum. Ragtime went dum 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 dum, and that was different. That was something people hadn't heard. And that's what made it popular.
E. Harry Kelly was born in the cradle of ragtime.
Kansas City kind of sat in the middle of the cradle of ragtime, from Sedalia to Joplin, St. Joe, Lawrence. And Kansas City, being the largest city in there, had the biggest music publishing companies.
E. Harry Kelly had the first ragtime hit to come out of Kansas City. His rag Peaceful Henry was the first big hit. That was 1901.
Kelly kept Kansas City's feet tapping with songs about familiar places. Oftentimes, it was places he would play.
The Muehleback was written for the Muehleback Hotel soon after it opened. Kelly played at the larger nightclubs in the hotels and did a good job with it. Everybody liked him, and he liked to write pieces for those places because it kind of gave him a foot in the door. He did Kansas for University of Kansas and included the phrase rock, chalk, jayhawk.
Kelly was the people's musician.
If people wanted marches during World War I, he wrote marches. They wanted foxtrots after the war, he wrote foxtrots. While other musicians got popular and left Kansas City, he stayed, and I think he was appreciated for that.
His pieces reflect the time and place. They reflect the Kansas City of the turn of the century.
For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherka. Around the turn of the century, Kansas City was a wide-open town. Prostitution was legal. Saloons and gambling halls were plentiful. But even then, sometimes folks found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Hello, I'm Bill Callaherka for Kansas City Crossroads. Those undesirables often found their way here to 21st and Vine, the site of Kansas City's Municipal Workhouse, a minimum security correctional facility designed for those convicted of minor offenses. But it wasn't long before city reformers developed the premise that those in trouble could be rehabilitated through hard work and the learning of a trade. One of the work projects assigned to prisoners was the building of the Kansas City Municipal Farm, located just west of Arrowhead Stadium. Officials at the time believed prisoners would be better served in an environment away from the central city. Opened in 1909, Leeds Farm was self-supporting through the work done by inmates. Growing vegetables taught sound work habits and put food on the table. Inmates also tended the cows at the farm's dairy operation, and they learned how to care for pigs on one of the largest municipal pig farms in the Midwest.
So the idea was, let's do positive things with these individuals while incarcerated. Let's help them build their self-esteem. Let's help them learn a trade. There was a machine shop, there was a woodworking shop. There were a number of activities that were provided then as a means for someone to maybe, even if they're only here for 30, 60, or 90 days, to develop a trade or develop an interest in a particular trade. And that was part of the rehabilitation process then as it is today.
Officials in Kansas City were optimistic that rehabilitation actually was possible. It was a concept considered quite revolutionary for its time, attracting visitors from all over the country to Leeds Farm.
The time of the past was, I think, truly looking at this idea of rehabilitation, the idea that people were not supposed to be sent to prison to be punished, but the idea was they were sent there as punishment. That concept is probably much more cutting edge than we might imagine.
Many reformers believe the cell does things to prisoners, but the farm does things for them. Through hard work, Leeds inmates earned privileges such as using the library or attending movies and religious services. Good behavior and demonstration of a good work ethic proved beneficial during hearings before the parole board and led to an early release.
There are far too many people in jail. I don't know where the end of that is going to be. It's something that we don't have any direct control of, but maybe some indirect control of.
The issue of more than 100 years ago, should jail be for punishment or rehabilitation, is still locked up in debate. For Kansas City Crossroads, I'm Bill Callaherka.
Kansas City Crossroads is a production of NBC 41, proud to bring you the stories of the people and events that have shaped our rich heritage.